Imagine stepping into a great hall on a winter evening in 1450. The air hits you, first wood, smoke roasting meat, something sweet and unfamiliar, all tangled with the sharp tang of unwashed wool and bodies packed close. Torches flicker along stone walls that seem to drink the light rather than reflect it. Your breath doesn't quite fog here, but it's cold enough that you're grateful for the crush of people, the press of shoulders and elbows as you squeeze toward the high table where the lord and lady sit beneath a canopy of embroidered silk. You probably won't survive this banquet if you're diabetic vegetarian or squeamish about eating things that still have their heads attached. Medieval nobles didn't just eat dinner, they performed it, orchestrated it, turned it into a spectacle that announced to everyone present exactly who held power, who controlled the land, who could afford to waste a year's peasant income on a single roasted swan dressed in its own feathers with gilded beak. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing near the entrance, which means you're watching the servers parade in from the kitchens. They come in waves, each course announced by a blast from a trumpet or the thump of a staff on stone. The first platters appear not the main event, but the opening salvo, what they called the first remove. Bread trenchers thick as your fist soaked in meat juices. Whole fish in saffron sauce, their eyes cloudy and accusing. A roasted heron, long neck curled back on itself, beak pointing at the rafters. Nothing here is simple. Nothing is just food. Every dish carries meaning, tells a story, makes a claim. That heron. It's a noble bird hunted with falcons in marshy estates where peasants aren't allowed to set foot. Eating it says, I own the water and the sky above it. The saffron, it costs more per ounce than most people earn in a month. The bread trencher will be tossed to the dogs or given to the poor afterward, because nobles don't eat the plate they're above that. You notice the seating arrangement. The high table sits elevated on a dais, looking down on everyone else. The lord and lady occupy the centre, flanked by honoured guests. Maybe a visiting bishop, a merchant who's loaned money a knight who's proven himself in some recent skirmish. Below them, lesser nobles and family members arrange themselves according to a calculus of blood favour and recent arguments. And below that, the lesser gentry, the hangers-on, the entertainers, the educated poor who've earned a place through cleverness or flattery. Where you sit determines what you eat. The best cuts travel to the high table. By the time a roasted peacock reaches the lower tables, it's been picked over the choicest meat already gone. Historians still argue whether this hierarchy was more about demonstrating generosity or rubbing everyone's nose in their subordinate status. Probably both. Medieval people were comfortable with contradiction. The hall itself amplifies everything. Stone walls throw back sound laughter, becomes cacophony. Conversation becomes roar. Rushes cover the floor mixed with herbs that release scent when crushed underfoot. Lavender meadow sweet, sometimes wormwood to discourage fleas. The smell is green and sharp under all that meat smoke. Dogs weave between the trestle tables, snatching dropped food, occasionally fighting over a bone, their growls adding to the general din. You're handed a cup shared probably with the person next to you. Medieval dining was communal in ways that would horrify a modern germaphobe. You drink, they drink, you both wipe the rim with your sleeve if you're polite. The wine is spiced, sweetened with honey warm from sitting near the kitchen fire. It tastes of cinnamon and something else you can't quite name, grains of paradise, maybe a West African spice that costs a fortune and tastes like pepper's exotic cousin. A servant approaches the high table carrying something under a silver dome. The room quiets slightly, sensing drama. This is part of the choreography, the reveal, the gasp, the applause. The dome lifts, and there it is, the first true spectacle of the evening. We'll get to the details in a moment, but for now just absorb the principle. This isn't about nutrition. This is theatre. This is propaganda. This is a lord saying to his guests, his rivals, his own anxious heart, I am rich enough, powerful enough, secure enough to turn dinner into art. The musicians strike up in the gallery above. Lutes shawms a portable organ wheezing out a popular tune. The sound competes with conversation with the clatter of knives on plates. Forks haven't been invented for table use yet, so everyone's using fingers, daggers and spoons. You learn quickly not to grab from the communal dish with your left hand. You learn to wipe your knife before cutting the next piece. You learn that drinking before someone of higher rank has drunk is a subtle insult that people will remember. Outside these walls, winter presses close. Peasants huddle in smoky hovels gnawing turnips and wondering if the seed grain will last until spring. But in here, for these few hours, abundance reigns. Excess becomes virtue. Waste becomes power. And you lucky guest get to witness what happens when people with too much money and too much time decide that dinner should be unforgettable. The silver dome has lifted, and there it is, a peacock fully roasted, but you'd never know it died. The bird sits upright on its platter neck, arched in that characteristic S-curved tail, feathers fanned out behind it in a cascade of iridescent blues and greens. For a moment your brain can't process what you're seeing. Is it alive? Is it stuffed? Then the smell hits you, roasted meat butter, expensive spices, and you understand. Someone spent hours on this. Here's how they did it. First, they killed the peacock. Mercifully quick, you hope, though. Medieval people weren't particularly sentimental about poultry. Then came the delicate part, skinning the bird while keeping the plumage completely intact. Feathers still attached to the hide. Imagine the patience required. One tear, one careless knife stroke, and you've ruined a display that's meant to impress a duke. The naked peacock got roasted on a spit basted with lard and whatever spice blend the cook favoured. Saffron for colour, ginger for heat, maybe some galingala root that tastes like ginger's sharper, more medicinal cousin. While the meat cooked someone else, probably a junior cook or a talented servant, carefully prepared the skin and feathers, treating them so they wouldn't rot or smell worse than they already did. Once the meat was done, they performed what amounts to taxidermy in reverse. The cooked peacock got dressed back up in its own skin feathers, smoothed and arranged, head positioned just so. Sometimes they went further, gilding the beak with actual gold leaf, placing the bird on a nest of herbs, or even rigging the mouth to breathe smoke by hiding burning herbs inside. The effect was unsettling and magnificent, a bird that looked alive but smelled delicious. You watch as carvers approach the peacock with ceremony. They don't just hack into it, there's a whole ritual to carving at noble tables, and peacock demands extra reverence. The senior carver makes the first cut with a flourish, revealing the white meat beneath all that pageantry. The choicest pieces go to the high table. Everyone else gets to look at the feathers. Historians still argue whether anyone actually enjoyed eating peacock. The consensus leans toward not particularly. The meat was reportedly dry tough, and not nearly as flavourful as chicken or capon. But that was never the point. You didn't serve peacock because it tasted good. You served it because you could, because you had the money to buy an exotic bird, the staff to prepare it elaborately, and the social standing to waste hours of labour on something your guests would pick at politely, while pretending to be impressed. Swans got the same treatment, though they were even more complicated because swan meat was better than peacock. Some people genuinely liked it, which meant you had to work harder to make the presentation transcend the eating. Swans got gilded beaks, their necks posed in elaborate curves, sometimes with tiny crowns perched between their eyes. The message was clear: this bird was too noble to eat plainly. We had to make it more. Other birds joined this parade of redressed poultry. Pheasants, herons, even large capons might be served in their feathers if the occasion demanded extra spectacle. The kitchens must have been chaos cooks sweating over fires, trying to time everything perfectly, while others worked in cooler corners preserving feathers and skin. One mistake, one burnt peacock or poorly attached wing, and you'd embarrassed your lord in front of his peers. Think about the symbolism for a moment. The peacock, even in classical times, represented pride, vanity, immortality. Its flesh supposedly didn't decay. Medieval people actually believed this based on ancient texts that no one had bothered to fact-check. So serving peacock wasn't just showing off your wealth, it was invoking ideas of eternal glory of a house that would never fall, a lineage that would never fade. The bird on the table became a prayer, a boast, a threat to rivals. And let's be honest, there's something deeply weird about eating an animal while it stares at you with glass eyes, dressed in the same outfit it wore in life. Modern sensibilities recoil. We like our meat anonymous, shrink-wrapped, divorced from any reminder that it once walked around. But medieval nobles seemed to enjoy the reminder. They wanted to see what they'd conquered, what they'd purchased, what they'd transformed from living creature into edible art. The peacock's feathers catch the torchlight as servants carry the platter around the room, letting everyone admire it before it gets carved completely. Children crane their necks for a better view. Lesser guests murmur appreciation, knowing their own cooks could never attempt such a thing. The lord beams with satisfaction. His wife smiles, though you wonder if she's calculating how much this single dish cost versus, say, new tapestries for the solar. You tear off a piece of bread and use it to soak up sauce from the communal dish, because that's what you do when you can't stop staring at a dead peacock dressed for a ball. The absurdity of it all hits you, the effort, the expense, the sheer commitment to impressing people who might not even remember this meal a month from now. But that's the game. That's always been the game. In a world where power was constantly contested, where alliances shifted like marsh fog, where a bad harvest or a political miscalculation could ruin you, these displays mattered. They said, we're still here. We're still powerful. We can afford to play. Just when you think the peacock marks the evening's pinnacle, servants wheel something into the hall that makes everyone fall silent. It's taller than a man, white as fresh snow, and it shouldn't exist. A castle complete with towers and battlements sits on a wooden cart. Except it's not stone, it's sugar. Spun, moulded, sculpted sugar, every crenellation perfect, every tiny window carved with a detail that makes your eyes hurt trying to focus in the flickering light. This is what they called a subtlety, though the name is magnificently ironic. There's nothing subtle about a 3-foot-tall sugar fortress. The term comes from the older meaning, something clever, ingenious, requiring subtle skill to create. And these things required skill that bordered on obsession. Somewhere in the kitchens or in a specialized confectioner's workshop, someone spent days on this, maybe weeks. You lean closer as the cart passes your section of the table. The castle isn't just decorative, it tells a story. Tiny sugar knights stand on the ramparts. A dragon coils around one tower, each scale individually formed. The lord's coat of arms decorates the main gate, painted in vegetable dyes onto the sugar surface. This isn't just dessert, it's propaganda you could theoretically eat, though no one will. Here's the thing about subtleties that recipes and accounts never quite capture: they were primarily about not eating them. Sugar was so expensive in the medieval period that using it this way was pure flex. A pound of sugar cost what a skilled craftsman might earn in several days. This castle probably contains 10, 20, maybe 30 pounds of the stuff. You could buy a decent horse for what this single display cost. The irony deepens when you realise sugar came from places most of these nobles would never see: Sicily, Cyprus, later the Atlantic islands, where European colonisers were just beginning to understand what sugar cultivation would become. The Crusades had introduced refined sugar to European palates, and now it was the ultimate luxury ingredient. Honey was for peasants. Sugar was for people who wanted to demonstrate they had trading connections, ready capital, and absolutely no concern for thrift. Subtleties came in every imaginable form. Religious themes were popular: the nativity saints performing miracles, the Virgin Mary crowned in spun sugar. Political themes worked too: a sugar rendering of a recent battle with the Lord's forces triumphant, and his enemies literally made of sugar ready to be symbolically consumed. Romantic themes pleased wedding guests, lovers meeting under sugar trees, Cupid drawing his bow hearts pierced with sugar arrows that looked alarmingly realistic. The construction techniques would make modern pastry chefs weep with frustration. No precise temperature control, no reliable ovens, no refined techniques passed down through culinary schools. These medieval confectioners worked by feel and experience. They boiled sugar syrup to exact stages: thread, soft ball, hard crack, judging by colour, bubble formation and instinct. 1 degree too hot and the sugar burned, turning bitter and brown. Too cool and it wouldn't hold its shape. Moulds helped for some elements. Carved wood or stone moulds produced repeated shapes: leaves, flowers, architectural details. But the true artistry came in hand sculpting, in coaxing hot sugar into forms it didn't want to hold, in painting details onto surfaces that could crack at a careless touch. Some confectioners added gum tragacanth to make the sugar more pliable, a trick borrowed from Islamic confectioners who'd mastered sugar art centuries before Europeans caught on. Historians still argue whether these displays were meant to be eaten eventually, or preserved as long as possible. Evidence suggests both approaches existed. Some subtleties were deliberately fragile, meant to be admired, then demolished pieces distributed to guests as favours. Others were built to last displayed for weeks or months, gradually gathering dust and probably mice, until they finally collapsed or someone threw them out. The sugar castle continues its circuit of the hall. You notice how quiet everyone's become. Even the dogs have stopped scrapping, as if they sense something important is happening. This is the moment the whole banquet has been building toward. Not the peacock impressive as that was, not the wine or the venison or whatever else has appeared. This impossible, impractical, inedible monument to wealth and skill. Children stare with open mouths. Adults maintain composure better, but you can see the calculation in their eyes. How much did this cost? Who made it? Where did they find someone with this skill? Could we commission something similar? Would our own cooks even know where to start? The Lord stands cup raised. He's going to make a speech. Of course he is. You don't spend a fortune on a sugar castle without explaining the symbolism to people too drunk or too dense to work it out themselves. He gestures at the fortress, and you catch fragments over the ambient noise. Something about strength-enduring legacy, sweet victory over enemies. The metaphors are mixed and slightly confused, but no one cares. They're applauding anyway, because that's what you do when your host has just demonstrated he can afford to build architecture out of imported luxury goods. A servant carefully lifts a sugar knight from the ramparts and presents it to the lady of the house. She accepts it with a smile, turns it in her fingers, then places it beside her plate. She won't eat it. It'll become a keepsake, probably displayed in her chambers until it gets sticky and starts attracting ants. Or maybe she'll gift it to someone passing along a piece of this evening's glory, this moment, when sugar became sculpture and dinner became art. You reach for your wine cup, suddenly aware that you're witnessing something that future generations will barely believe. Centuries from now, sugar will be cheap ubiquitous, packed into every processed food, until it becomes a health crisis rather than a luxury. But right now in this smoky hall, it's magic. Made solid wealth, you can see and almost taste a monument to the strange places human creativity goes when money and ego collide. The sugar castle still gleams on its cart near the high table when the next wave of dishes arrives and you notice something catching the torchlight in a way that food shouldn't. Gold. Actual gold hammered so thin you could read through it, draped over roasted capons like expensive shrouds. The birds shimmer as servants carry them past their crispy skin hidden under sheets of precious metal that flutter slightly in the draughts that plague every medieval hall. You're watching people prepare to eat gold. Let that settle in your mind for a moment. Not gold-coloured food, not something painted to look like gold, actual elemental gold, the same substance men die mining. Kingdoms hoard and merchants weigh with paranoid precision. And these nobles are about to put it in their mouths, chew it with their teeth and swallow it down with spiced wine. Here's the practical reality: gold leaf is inert. It passes through your digestive system without interacting with anything, emerging eventually in your chamber pot, looking exactly as it did going in, just more unfortunately located. Medieval people knew this, they weren't stupid. But that knowledge made the gesture even more extravagant. You weren't eating gold because it tasted good or provided nutrition. You were eating it because you could, because you had so much wealth that you could literally excrete precious metal. The goldsmiths who made this leaf worked in specialized workshops, hammering gold coins or scrap between sheets of vellum until the metal spread impossibly thin, about 100 times thinner than a human hair. The process took hours, required immense skill, and produced sheets so delicate they'd tear if you breathed on them wrong. Then cooks or specialized servants had to apply these fragments to food without destroying them, a task requiring steady hands and probably quite a bit of cursing. Everything got gilded at truly ambitious feasts. Bread arrived at the table glowing gold, each loaf looking like something from a fairy tale. Fruits, apples, pears, quinces wore golden skins over their natural ones. Whole fish swam in aspic under gold leaf scales, each one individually applied. Meat pies had golden crusts that crackled when cut, revealing the merely expensive ingredients inside. Even wine sometimes received gold flakes floating in it, sparkling as they caught the light, turning every cup into a treasure chest. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but medieval people didn't do subtle. Gold represented divinity, eternal life, incorruptibility, the same qualities attributed to Christ, to saints, to kings ruling by divine right. Eating gilded food associated you with those qualities, suggested that your body was a temple worthy of such adornment. It also said something simpler: I have gold to waste. In an economy where most people never touched a gold coin in their entire lives, serving it as garnish was the ultimate power move. Historians still argue about how widespread this practice actually was. Account books from royal and ducal households confirm gold leaf purchases for feasts. Recipes in manuscripts like the form of curie occasionally specify and gild it as a final step. But did middling nobles attempt it? Did wealthy merchants climbing into gentry try to buy legitimacy one gilded capon at a time? Probably. Human nature doesn't change if the truly powerful are doing something everyone beneath them wants to copy it. The gilded capons reach the high table and carvers go to work. The gold leaf tears and fragments as knives slice through meat, creating a strange effect, patches of shimmer against white flesh, like stars scattered across a night sky made of chicken. Guests receive portions dusted with gold fragments, and you watch them eat, without hesitation, without ceremony, as if consuming precious metal is just another Thursday. Let's talk about the other metals for a moment, because gold wasn't alone in this madness. Silver leaf appeared too cheaper, but still impressive draped over fish dishes. Especially the colour match made aesthetic sense. Some accounts mention tin leaf, which was actually toxic but looked similar enough that unscrupulous cooks could make substitutions and hope no one noticed or died. And there were constant attempts to fake it. Egg yolk mixed with saffron could create a golden glaze that fooled distant observers, though it lacked that crucial shimmer up close. You bite into your own portion bread soaked in sauce, and you don't get any gold because you're not sitting high enough. That's fine. You're not sure you'd want to eat it anyway, despite the safety assurances. There's something psychologically weird about consuming metal, even inert metal. Your brain keeps saying this isn't food, even as people around you treat it as the most normal thing in the world. The dogs beneath the tables get scraps of gilded meat thrown down by careless nobles. You watch a hound sniff suspiciously at a piece of gold-covered capon, then eat it anyway, because dogs have different priorities than humans. Somewhere in this hall's grounds, in the kennels or the garden corners, there's dog shit containing actual gold. The thought makes you laugh into your wine cup, drawing a strange look from your neighbour. More gilded dishes keep coming. A roasted boar's head wears a gold leaf crown between its ears. A swan, remember that peacock has gold-tipped feathers mixed with its natural white ones, creating a pattern that might be beautiful if it weren't so bizarre. Pastries emerge from the kitchens looking like treasure chests, their crusts shimmering, their contents mundane but elevated by association. The expense is dizzying when you calculate it. Each sheet of gold leaf costs what a peasant family might live on for days. This single feast probably features enough gold to buy several acres of farmland or fund a small military campaign or build a chapel. Instead, it's being masticated by nobles who'll forget this meal in a week, absorbed into the endless pageant of excess that defines their lives. But here's what makes it brilliant as a strategy: everyone will remember the gold. They'll forget the individual dishes, lose track of whether the venison was good, argue about which wine they preferred. But they'll remember eating food covered in gold at Lord So-and-so's feast. They'll tell others, the story will spread, and that's worth more than the actual gold cost in a world where reputation and perceived power mattered as much as armies or coin. A platter arrives that confuses you at first. The meat is dark, rich-looking, swimming in a sauce thick with wine and spices. It smells incredible, like the best roast you've ever encountered, with undertones of pepper and something floral you can't quite name. A servant announces it, clearly projecting over the hall's din, porpoise in black sauce for the pleasure of his lordship. And suddenly people who are slouching sit up straighter, because this is the medieval equivalent of serving Wagyu beef or white truffles. Wait, porpoise, the aquatic mammal. The thing that breathes air and nurses its young and would absolutely fail any reasonable definition of fish. Yes, that porpoise. And here's where medieval Christianity gets wonderfully absurdly creative with its own rules. The church demanded that Christians abstain from meat on Fridays during Lent, on various saints' days, and during other periods of fasting that added up to roughly a third of the year. Meat meant the flesh of terrestrial animals: beef, pork, mutton, chicken, anything that walked or flew. Fish were permitted, the logic being that they were cold-blooded, simpler creatures, less fleshly in nature. Never mind that this reasoning made no biological sense. It was theological sense, and these what mattered. So some brilliant ecclesiastical mind looked at a porpoise and thought, it lives in water, it swims. Therefore, fish. The argument gained traction. Porpoises became classified as fish for fasting purposes, along with dolphins, whales, seals, and even barnacle geese, those last ones, because medieval people genuinely believed barnacle geese hatched from barnacles rather than eggs, making them somehow more plant than animal. The logic was tortured, but the church authorities accepted it, probably because wealthy patrons really wanted to eat porpoise during Lent. You watch nobles at the high table receive generous portions. Porpoise was expensive, hunting them required boats, skilled harpooners, coastal access, and considerable luck. The meat was prized for its rich, almost beef-like quality. Some compared it to venison. Others insisted it had a unique flavour, all its own darkly savoury, slightly sweet best, when heavily spiced to complement rather than mask its essential character. Historians still argue about whether medieval people actually believed porpoises were fish, or just enjoyed the convenient loophole. Written sources show genuine confusion, some authors earnestly categorizing marine mammals with codfish, and herring, others winking at the obvious absurdity while eating porpoise stew during Holy Week. Probably both attitudes coexisted the way modern people simultaneously know factory farming is problematic but still eat bacon. The theological gymnastics extended further than you'd imagine. Beavers got classified as fish because of their scaly tails and semi-aquatic lifestyle. Puffins, those adorable birds that look like flying penguins, were declared fish by Irish monks who wanted to eat them during fasting periods, arguing that they spent so much time swimming they'd clearly become more water creature than bird. The monks probably laughed while making this argument, or maybe they were perfectly serious. Medieval Christianity contained multitudes. The porpoise on tonight's menu probably came from coastal waters within a few days' travel any longer, and the meat would have spoiled despite salt packing. Once caught, the animal was butchered much like a pig, which it vaguely resembled in shape. The blubber got rendered for oil. The meat got divided into cuts, some for immediate use, some for salting and preservation. The best portions went to the nobility. Lesser cuts might feed monastery communities or wealthy merchants' households during Lent. Preparation varied by region and cook skill. Tonight's black sauce, probably wine reduced with dried fruits, breadcrumbs for thickening ginger pepper. Maybe some cinnamon was standard for expensive meats at noble tables. The dark colour came from the wine and possibly some blood from the meat itself, creating an appearance that modern diners might find off-putting, but medieval palates found appealing. They liked visual drama food that looked as bold as it tasted. You're not getting porpoise at your section of the table. The dish doesn't stretch this far down the social ladder. Instead, you're making do with pike in green sauce respectable fish, properly classified, no theological creativity required. The pike is good bones notwithstanding, and the herb sauce brightens it nicely. But you can't help watching the high table, wondering what porpoise actually tastes like, whether it justifies the expense and the ethical contortions. The dogs beneath the tables get porpoise scraps tossed down by nobles who've eaten their fill. The hounds don't care about taxonomy or church law. They know meat when they smell it, and they fall on these scraps with enthusiasm usually reserved for stolen bacon. Think about what this loophole reveals about medieval society. The church had genuine power. People took fasting rules seriously, confessed. When they broke them, did penance for violations. But the church also knew its audience. Push too hard on wealthy donors who funded cathedral construction and monastery upkeep, and you'd create problems. Better to allow some flexibility, interpret scripture creatively, let nobles eat their porpoise, and feel technically virtuous. Everyone maintained face. The rules stayed intact in principle, and porpoise hunters stayed employed. A visiting monk at one of the lower tables receives a portion of porpoise special dispensation for a learned guest. You watch him eat it with obvious pleasure, no hesitation, no guilt. He's probably written treatises on proper fasting. He might have argued in chapter meetings about the exact definition of fish in scriptural context. And now he's savouring mammal flesh on a Friday evening, confident that he's violating no divine law. The servers clear porpoise platters and bring the next remove. You've lost count of courses at this point 6-8. The evening has achieved a kind of momentum where individual dishes blur together into a continuous stream of excess. But you'll remember the porpoise discussion tomorrow when your head aches from wine and your stomach protests the quantity of rich food. You'll remember that someone somewhere looked at a porpoise and decided fish enough. A new dish enters with ceremony that exceeds even the peacock's arrival. The servers move in practiced formation, and you hear whispers ripple through the hall before you see what they're carrying. Then it comes into view a swan, massive and white, its neck curved in a graceful arch, positioned on a bed of herbs and flowers, like it's floating on an invisible lake. The feathers have been preserved and reattached with the same technique you saw with the peacock. But there's an additional element here that makes several guests lean forward. A golden coronet sits between the swan's eyes, and small banners displaying the royal coat of arms have been inserted among the tail feathers. This isn't just showing off anymore. This is making a political statement with poultry. Swans belong to the crown. Not metaphorically, not traditionally, legally and absolutely. In England, all unmarked mute swans in open waters were property of the monarch, a right dating back centuries, and enforced with surprising severity. You couldn't just hunt a swan because you fancied one for dinner. You needed explicit royal permission, a grant of swan rights that might come with the title land ownership or special favour. Violating this law could cost you everything, fines that would bankrupt you. Imprisonment, sometimes worse, if you'd offended the wrong people. So this swan on tonight's table tells everyone present something crucial. The lord of this manor has royal connections, special privileges, the kind of access to power that lets him serve birds that most nobles can only admire from a distance. He's not just wealthy, he's connected. And in the medieval political landscape, connections often mattered more than gold. The tradition went deep into English culture. Swan-upping, the annual census and marking of swans on the Thames, employed specialised royal swanherd who knew every bird, every breeding pair, every cygnet hatched that season. Swans that belonged to livery companies or powerful nobles bore distinctive marks on their beaks, tiny nicks and patterns that identified ownership as clearly as a brand on cattle. Unmarked swans defaulted to the crown. It was a system that sounds absurd until you remember that swans were valuable good eating, impressive displays, and symbolic of purity, grace, and royal power. You watch the carving ceremony unfold. This isn't casual butchering. The carver approaches the swan with almost religious reverence, and you notice he's better dressed than the servants who carried lesser dishes. Carving was a specialised skill, especially for royal or high-status birds. The carver needed to know proper techniques, understand the hierarchy of cuts, maintain grace under the gaze of critical nobles who'd watched this done hundreds of times and would notice any mistake. The first cut releases a wave of aroma roasted meat, yes, but also a gamey richness that distinguishes swan from ordinary poultry. The meat is dark, more like duck than chicken, and reportedly has a strong flavour that needs careful preparation to shine. Some medieval recipes suggest lengthy marinating in wine and spices. Others recommend serving it with sharp sauces, sorrel, verjuice, anything acidic enough to cut through the richness. Historians still argue whether swan actually tasted good, or whether people ate it purely for status. Contemporary accounts are divided. Some praise it as a delicacy worthy of royal tables. Others damn it with faint praise or admit that tough old swans could be nearly inedible without extensive boiling or stewing. Young cygnets slaughtered before they developed the muscular toughness of adult birds were generally preferred, but serving an adult swan made a bigger visual impact which often trumped culinary considerations. The high table receives the choicest portions, breast meat sliced thin, arranged artfully sauced, and garnished. The lord accepts his plate with visible satisfaction. This is his moment, the culmination of whatever political manoeuvring secured him the right to serve this bird. He might have hosted a royal hunting party months ago. He might have loaned money to someone close to the crown. He might have rendered military service that earned him swan privileges along with land grants. However it happened, he's advertising it now, making sure every guest understands his elevated status. Lower tables get lesser cuts if they get any swan at all. You're far enough down the hierarchy that you'll be lucky to taste it. A servant passes near you with a platter of scraps, neck, meat, wing pieces, bits hacked off during the carving process. You manage to snag a small portion when the platter pauses at your section. The meat is rich, almost liver-like in its intensity, with a wild flavour that speaks of cold water and open air. It's interesting rather than delicious, impressive more than enjoyable. The symbolism layers deeper than just royal ownership. Swans mated for life, making them symbols of fidelity and eternal love. They appeared in romance poetry and courtly love traditions, in stories where faithful lovers transformed into swans to escape tragedy. Serving swan at a wedding feast carried extra meaning, a blessing of sorts, a hope that the couple would prove as loyal as the birds. At other feasts, it simply represented the highest tier of culinary and social achievement. Think about the absurdity of reserving an entire species for royal consumption. Deer made sense, you needed to prevent poaching to maintain hunting stock. But swans? They weren't being overhunted. They weren't struggling to survive. Someone simply decided that these particular birds would belong to the crown, and that decision stuck for centuries, enforced by law, custom, and the threat of royal displeasure. The swan's carcass gets carried around the room after the carving is complete, showing guests the hollow shell of bird that once wore all those impressive feathers. The neck dangles boneless now, and you notice how long it is, how elegant, even in death and dismemberment. A few feathers have come loose during the carving, and float near the platter, catching torchlight, reminding everyone what this bird looked like before knives and heat transformed it. Children at the lower tables crane their necks to see their faces reflecting the torchlight and wonder. Most of them have probably never seen a swan served before. They might not see one again until they're adults, if ever, unless their own fortunes rise dramatically. This is a memory being formed, a story they'll tell about the time they attended a feast, grand enough to include royal swans. The lady of the house receives a small dish of swan broth, clear and golden, garnished with herbs. She sips it delicately, performing enjoyment whether she feels it or not. This is her role: to appreciate, to validate her husband's display, to embody the grace that justifies all this expense and effort. She probably had input on the menu, might have argued for or against serving swan, calculated the political implications of this choice. Now she drinks broth and smiles and plays her part in the theatre. The next wave of dishes arrive shrouded in aromatic clouds that make your eyes water and your sinuses clear instantly. Every platter releases steam thick with spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, saffron scents so intense they physically assault the air. You're watching wealth transform into vapour, because these spices cost more per ounce than most of the meat they're supposedly enhancing. A single peppercorn was worth enough that rent could be paid in pepper. Saffron required thousands of hand-picked crocus stigmas for a single ounce. And here they are, ground into pastes and sauces so thick with spice you could probably stand a spoon upright in them. Medieval nobles didn't season food. They obliterated it with spices, drowned it, mummified it in aromatic excess that would make a modern chef weep or possibly call the authorities. A simple roasted chicken might receive more spices than an entire week of contemporary cooking uses. Venison arrived at the table black with pepper yellow with saffron rusty red with cinnamon perfumed with cloves until it smelled more like a church censer than dinner. The reasoning made sense in its way. Spices came from impossibly far away, India, Indonesia, East Africa, the spice islands that Europeans could barely locate on a map but would eventually kill over. These substances travelled months or years to reach European markets, passing through dozens of middlemen who each took their profit. By the time pepper reached a noble's kitchen, it had crossed deserts, oceans, and multiple civilizations. Using it generously announced, "I have trade connections. I have ready money. I have access to the world's luxuries." You watch a platter of venison pass, and it's been so thoroughly coated in spice paste that you can barely see the meat underneath. The crust looks almost like tree bark, dark, cracked, aromatic. When the carver slices into it, steam erupts, carrying waves of scent that make nearby guests actually cough. This isn't subtle flavouring, this is assault by pepper. Some historians argue that heavy spicing disguised the taste of spoiled meat that medieval people used. Spices the way modern cooks use hot sauce to mask rot and decay. This theory is mostly nonsense. Spoiled meat made you sick regardless of how much cinnamon you dumped on it, and medieval people knew that. Nobles who could afford these spices could certainly afford fresh meat. They weren't idiots risking food poisoning to impress guests. The real reason was simpler: they liked it. Medieval palates enjoyed intense, complex flavours that combined sweet, savoury and piquant in ways modern Western cuisines abandoned centuries ago. They wanted food that announced itself, that created strong sensory experiences, that paired well with the heavily spiced wines they drank. And yes, they wanted everyone to know they could afford to cook this way. Saffron particularly obsessed medieval cooks. The spice-coloured food, a brilliant gold yellow echoing the gold leaf we saw earlier, but edible and aromatic. Rice dishes, egg preparations, sauces, broths, all got the saffron treatment. Account books from noble households show saffron purchases that would buy livestock. Kitchen workers handled it reverently, knowing that spilling even a pinch meant waste that would be noticed and punished. Pepper came in multiple varieties: long pepper cube, pepper grains of paradise. Each had distinct flavours and costs. Black pepper was standard, the baseline heat that appeared in nearly every savoury dish. Long pepper was more expensive and supposedly more refined. Grains of paradise, those seeds from West Africa, provided a complex spiciness, with floral notes prized by nobles who wanted something beyond ordinary pepper. Cinnamon appeared everywhere it had no business being. Medieval recipes put cinnamon in meat dishes, fish preparations, vegetable sides, and naturally all desserts. The spice came from Ceylon, travelling impossible distances to reach European markets, and commanded prices that made it accessible only to the wealthy. Serving cinnamon-heavy dishes said I can afford to import bark from the other side of the known world to make my chicken taste interesting. Cloves studded everything. Whole cloves poked into roasted meats like decorative armour. Ground cloves thickened sauces and flavoured wines. The tiny dried flower buds came from the Moluccas, the actual spice islands, and their journey to Europe involved monsoon winds, pirates, Venetian merchants, and markup chains that multiplied their value at each step. By the time cloves reached England or France, they'd become small treasures. You managed to secure a piece of meat from a passing platter mutton, you think, though the spice crust makes identification difficult. The first bite is overwhelming. Your mouth fills with pepper heat, cinnamon sweetness, something floral that might be cardamom, and underneath all that, possibly some actual lamb flavour struggling to make itself known. It's not bad exactly. It's just intense, aggressive, a flavour profile that doesn't apologise or retreat. Historians still argue whether medieval overspicing reflected genuine preference or just competitive display. Probably both. Humans are complicated. You can simultaneously enjoy a flavour and use it to show off. Think about modern caviar or truffle oil. People genuinely like these things, but they're also absolutely using them to signal wealth and sophistication. The spice clouds thicken as more dishes arrive. Pork ribs glazed with honey and ginger. Fish fillets coated in saffron sauce so thick it looks like paint. A whole rabbit roasted and then essentially shellacked in cinnamon paste. Vegetable dishes. Yes, vegetables appeared at noble tables, though less frequently than meat swimming in spiced butter or oil. Your eyes keep watering. The air in the hall has become almost narcotic with spice density. People are sneezing. Someone near you is coughing into their sleeve. But the feast continues because stopping now would suggest weakness and inability to handle what the kitchens produce. You're all trapped in an arms race of aromatic endurance. Think about the kitchens for a moment. Cooks working through clouds of pepper and cinnamon, their eyes streaming their lungs protesting, grinding spices by hand, no electric mills, no shortcuts, using mortars and pestles until their arms ached. Measuring expensive substances with paranoid precision, knowing that every grain mattered, that waste would be noted and possibly punished. Combining these spices into pastes and sauces according to recipes that existed mostly in memory and experience, passed cook to apprentice through observation rather than written instruction. The dogs under the tables are losing their minds with scent overload. You watch a hound sneeze violently 3 times in succession, then resume begging for scraps despite obvious nasal distress. The servants who clear plates must be developing tolerance levels that would impress modern pharmaceutical researchers. Another platter passes, you've lost count, and this one releases clouds of something that makes your head snap back. Mustard maybe, or horseradish, combined with enough pepper to weaponize it. The noble who receives this portion attacks it with visible enthusiasm, tearing meat from bones, wiping sauce from his beard, drinking deeply to cool his mouth, then immediately taking another bite. This is what peak medieval dining looks like, voluntary suffering in pursuit of flavour status and bragging rights. A commotion starts near the kitchen entrance, excited whispers servants, trying to suppress grins, musicians in the gallery striking up something playful and anticipatory. You crane your neck to see what's approaching, and at first you can't process what you're looking at. It's a massive pie, certainly crusted and golden, big enough that 4 servants struggle to carry the wooden board it sits on. But there's something odd about it, something moving at the top where steam vents have been cut. The pie reaches the centre of the hall, positioned where everyone can see. The Lord stands grinning like a child with a secret. A server approaches with a knife theatrical pause and cuts a wide opening in the top crust, and then chaos. Birds explode from the pie. Living birds. Dozens of them, blackbird starlings, maybe some sparrows erupting in a panicked flutter of wings and confused chirping. They scatter in every direction, swooping over tables, landing in rafters, occasionally dive-bombing guests who duck and laugh and shriek. One bird manages to fly directly into a torch, singeing itself and adding the smell of burnt feathers to the evening's aromatic collection. The dogs go absolutely feral, barking and leaping, trying to catch birds that stay frustratingly out of reach. You're watching the infamous 4 and 20 blackbirds, except it's more than 24, and they're creating pandemonium that the servants are trying to manage with long poles and nets. The nursery rhyme that will eventually immortalize this practice won't be written for centuries, but the spectacle itself is already well established at ambitious feasts. This is entertainment that doubles as dinner theatre, and judging by the Lord's delighted expression, it's going exactly as planned. Here's how they pulled this off. The pie wasn't actually meant for eating. Not this outer shell, anyway. Bakers created a massive coffin, the medieval term, for a pie crust no relation to burial, that was essentially an edible architecture project. They baked it empty, reinforced with internal supports if necessary, creating a vessel large enough to hold birds. The birds got inserted just before serving, probably through an opening in the bottom that servants sealed at the last moment. The creatures sat in darkness, confused and cramped, until that knife opened their prison and they bolted for freedom. The inner psychological experience of those birds probably shouldn't be examined too closely. They went from cage to pie to medieval hall, in quick succession, each environment more terrifying than the last. But medieval nobles weren't concerned with avian psychology. They wanted surprise spectacle, the moment when static food transformed into living chaos. Not every bird pie used birds. Some accounts describe pies containing frogs, which must have produced a different kind of chaos when they started hopping across the table. Other recipes mention releasing rabbits, though how you'd get rabbits into a pie and keep them there seems mechanically challenging. The principle remained constant hide, something alive in seemingly inanimate food, reveal it dramatically, let confusion and delight ensue. Historians still argue whether anyone actually ate the outer pie crust after birds vacated it. Probably not at sophisticated feasts. The crust was utilitarian, built for structure rather than flavour. But waste-conscious households might have fed it to servants or dogs. The birds themselves rarely ended up eaten that evening. Catching panicked birds in a torchlit hall proved difficult, and by the time servants cornered them, their meat was stressed and unappetizing. They were entertainment, not protein. The tradition had variations across Europe. English nobles favoured blackbirds and other songbirds. French courts sometimes used more exotic specimens, parrots if you could afford them, or imported birds that would seem even more miraculous when they emerged. Italian feasts occasionally went abstract, filling pies with rose petals or perfumed papers that created visual rather than animate surprise. But living creatures provided the best shock value. You watch a servant with a long net finally corner a blackbird in the rafters. The bird chirps indignantly as he captures it and carries it toward the kitchen entrance. Other servants are conducting similar operations throughout the hall, slowly restoring order to the controlled chaos. The musicians have shifted to calmer music, helping settle the energy level back down. The dogs remain agitated, sniffing at corners, where they're sure birds must be hiding, occasionally barking at shadows. One hound has actually caught a slower blackbird and is being scolded by a servant to drop it, which the dog considers deeply unfair after all that effort. Think about the planning this required. Someone had to catch or purchase dozens of live birds, keep them alive and healthy, until the feast coordinate their insertion into the pie at precisely the right moment, all while managing the 50 other details of a massive banquet. The timing had to be perfect too early, and the birds might suffocate or weaken too late, and the pie might cool, visibly ruining the illusion that it just came from the oven. The Lord is accepting congratulations from nearby nobles, all of whom are praising his creativity and the spectacle's execution. Several guests are probably taking mental notes, planning to steal this idea for their own feasts. Culinary one-upmanship drove medieval entertaining. If your rival served birds in a pie, you'd need to serve something even more surprising. This is how you got arms races that escalated to sugar castles and gilded everything. A few birds remain loose in the rafters, settling into corners, chirping occasionally. They'll probably live in this hall for days or weeks, sustained by dropped food scraps becoming part of the household ecology until they find a way out or cats find them. Medieval halls already housed mice rats and various insects, a few extra birds barely registered. The empty pie gets carried away, its job complete. You notice it wasn't actually empty inside. Beneath where the birds had been, there's another pie, a real one filled with actual food that people might eat. This was the backup plan, the practical element hidden beneath the theatrical one. Servants bring this second pie back properly carved, now distributing portions of whatever's inside meat and eggs in aspic, probably something that could withstand sitting inside another pie without spoiling. You receive a small piece, and it's actually good. Rich, savoury, well-spiced, but not overwhelmingly so. The contrast with the chaos of moments ago makes it taste better somehow. You're eating the aftermath of surprise, the practical foundation beneath medieval spectacle. The birds are already becoming memory story, the thing people will talk about tomorrow and next week. Remember when the pie exploded? They'll say, laughing, slightly drunk, nostalgic for chaos that happened hours ago. Another bird swoops past your head, still fleeing invisible threats, and you duck instinctively. Medieval entertainment contained genuine surprise because they hadn't yet categorized and domesticated every possible spectacle. Each feast had potential for real chaos, actual unpredictability. That made them dangerous and magical in ways modern dining can rarely match. The servants are still chasing stray birds when the next platter arrives, and this one makes you do a double take. It's small, almost modest compared to the peacocks and swans and sugar castles, but there's something deeply unsettling about it. A roasted hedgehog sits curled on a bed of greens, its quills still intact, or rather reattached, making it look like it might uncurl and waddle away at any moment. The spines glisten with some kind of glaze-catching torchlight, and the whole presentation has a fairy tale quality that can't quite decide if it's charming or disturbing. Hedgehog. They're serving hedgehog, and not as a joke, not as a dare, but as a legitimate delicacy that certain nobles specifically requested. You watch as a carver approaches with visible expertise, clearly having done this before, ready to navigate the quill situation and extract the meat underneath. Here's the thing about medieval hedgehog preparation, it was surprisingly sophisticated. Cooks didn't just toss the creature on a fire and hope for the best. They gutted and cleaned it carefully, then encased the body in clay, a thick protective shell that would protect the meat during cooking. The clay-wrapped hedgehog went into the coals or an oven. When it was done, you cracked off the hardened clay and the quills came away with it stuck in the dried mud, leaving clean meat underneath. But that wasn't theatrical enough for noble feasts. So after cooking and cleaning, someone, probably a patient cook's assistant with steady hands, would reattach the quills, inserting them back into the roasted skin one by one. It was taxidermy meets cuisine, creating a hedgehog that looked alive but smelled delicious, that maintained its characteristic appearance while being thoroughly dead and edible. The taste accounts vary wildly. Some medieval sources praise hedgehog as sweet, tender, almost pork-like. Others damn it as greasy and strong-flavoured, requiring heavy spicing to become palatable. Part of the variation probably came from diet. A hedgehog that had been eating grubs and beetles would taste different from one that had been feasting on fallen fruit. Part came from preparation skill, and part probably came from expectations. If you believed hedgehog was a delicacy, you'd probably convince yourself it tasted good. The practice went deeper than simple novelty. Hedgehogs appeared in folk medicine, their meat supposedly curing everything from leprosy to baldness. Medieval people genuinely believed that eating certain animals transferred their characteristics to the consumer. Hedgehogs were hardy, survived winters, defended themselves effectively despite their small size. Consuming them might grant similar resilience. The logic was sympathetic magic dressed in culinary practice. Gypsies and travelling peoples ate hedgehog regularly by necessity and tradition, which meant it carried class associations. When nobles served it at feasts, they were appropriating peasant food and elevating it through elaborate presentation. This happened with other foods too. Rabbit, certain birds, fish that poor people ate from necessity became delicacies when served with enough ceremony and expense. You watch the carver work on the hedgehog and it's delicate surgery. The quills come off easily now, they were never properly attached, just artfully positioned. Underneath the meat is dark, surprisingly substantial. The high table receives portions first naturally. The lord takes a symbolic bite, nods approval, signals that this unusual dish meets standards. Permission granted, other high-status guests accept their portions. Historians still argue about how common hedgehog actually was at noble feasts. Recipe manuscripts mention it occasionally, but whether those recipes saw regular use or represented aspirational curiosity is unclear. Account books rarely itemize hedgehog purchases the way they document swan or venison. It might have been a regional specialty, popular in areas where hedgehogs were abundant and local tradition endorsed their consumption. Or it might have been a rare novelty trotted out when hosts wanted to surprise guests with something unexpected. The meat reaches some of the lower tables, including yours. You examine your portion with fascination and mild revulsion. It's been cut small, served in a rich sauce that probably contains wine honey and the usual battery of spices. The first bite is interesting. The texture is fine-grained, denser than chicken, but not quite as robust as pork. The flavour is mild, slightly gamey, mostly overwhelmed by the sauce. You can see why heavy spicing would be standard. The meat itself doesn't announce much personality. Think about the skill required to make this dish work. First catching hedgehogs without getting spiked, they're nocturnal, defensive, and surprisingly quick when motivated. Then butchering the clay baking technique that required precise temperature judgment to cook the meat without destroying it. Then the requilling process, which demanded patience and probably resulted in several punctured fingers before anyone got good at it. All this for a creature that weighed maybe 2 pounds and yielded a few ounces of actual meat. The presentation matters more than the protein. That's true for most of tonight's feast, but especially for hedgehog. You're serving something unexpected, something that makes guests pause and reconsider their assumptions about what belongs on a noble table. You're demonstrating that your kitchens can handle any challenge, prepare any creature, transform the humble and spiky into the artful and edible. Children at the lower tables are fascinated by the hedgehog quills being passed around as curiosities. Servants let them examine the spines, which are stiffer than porcupine quills but not as dangerous. A young boy tries to attach one to his sleeve, creating a makeshift armour that makes his friends laugh. The quills will probably end up scattered throughout the hall, trodden into rushes collected later by servants who'll dispose of them, or possibly save them. Hedgehog spines had minor uses in folk crafts. The dogs show no interest in hedgehog scraps when they're tossed down. Apparently even medieval hounds have standards, or maybe the spice combination doesn't appeal to canine palates. The rejected bits sit on the floor until servants sweep them up during the next clearing cycle. A guest at the high table is telling a story you catch fragments about a hedgehog he once saw in his garden, how it curled up when his dog investigated how the dog learned a painful lesson about respecting small spiky creatures. The story gets laughs, becomes a metaphor about underestimating opponents, transitions into political gossip about a minor lord who recently overreached and got humiliated. The hedgehog on the table has sparked conversation, which was probably part of the point. You finish your portion mainly because leaving food uneaten at a feast this elaborate feels wasteful and slightly insulting. The sauce was good, you tell yourself. The meat was acceptable. You've now eaten hedgehog at a medieval noble's feast, which is not an experience many people across history can claim. That counts for something even if you're not entirely sure what. The servers approach with something that catches the torchlight in a way that makes you think of stained glass windows, translucent amber-coloured, wobbling slightly as it moves. It's a massive moulded dish, dome-shaped, gleaming with an internal complexity that draws your eye deeper. You're looking at aspic, or what medieval people call jelly, and inside this quivering architectural achievement, you can see suspended objects, hard-boiled eggs, sliced to show their golden yolks, herbs arranged in decorative patterns, chunks of what might be eel or pike, possibly some vegetables all held in perfect stasis within the jellied walls. This is edible amber. This is food that figured out how to stop time, at least visually. The effect is genuinely beautiful in a slightly disturbing way, like looking at insects preserved in tree sap, except you're supposed to eat this. Making aspic in a medieval kitchen required patience that borders on meditation. You started with bones, fish, bones, meat bones, sometimes calves' feet, anything rich in collagen that would break down into gelatin during long slow cooking. These bones simmered for hours in water, with herbs creating a stock that filled the kitchen with steam and aroma. Then came the clarification process using egg whites to capture impurities, straining through cloth until the liquid ran clear and golden. The real artistry came in the assembly. As the stock cooled and began to thicken, cooks had a narrow window to create their compositions. They'd pour a layer of aspic into a mould, let it set, slightly arrange. Objects, artfully add another layer, place more objects building upward in geological patience. Timing was critical, too liquid, and everything floated chaotically, too firm, and layers wouldn't bond. Medieval cooks developed intuitive knowledge of gelatin states that modern pastry chefs would recognize the wobble test, the surface skin check, the fingertip touch, that told you exactly when to proceed. You watch as the aspic dome gets positioned on the high table. Candlelight passes through it, creating shadows and highlights that make the suspended ingredients look like they're floating in honey. The visual effect justifies the hours of labour. This is food as sculpture, as statement, as proof that your kitchen staff includes people who understand both chemistry and aesthetics. The Lord signals for carving, and a server approaches with a knife and serving spatula. The first cut breaks the dome's surface tension, and you hear an audible sound, a soft crack, a release. The blade slides through easily, the jelly parting cleanly, and suddenly you can see the cross-section layers of carefully arranged ingredients. Herb sprigs positioned like deliberate brushstrokes, egg slices creating geometric patterns. Portions get distributed to the high table first. Each serving is a perfect slice of translucent architecture holding its shape, but wobbling gently on the plate. Nobles examine their portions with appreciation, noting the craftsmanship, commenting on the clarity of the jelly. This is technical achievement you can see and taste, assuming you like eating cold savoury gelatin. Historians still argue about whether medieval people genuinely enjoyed aspic or just appreciated it as a display of skill. The texture certainly divides opinion. Some people love the slippery melting sensation. Others find it unsettling, too close to eating something that hasn't quite decided whether it's liquid or solid. Medieval palates might have been more accepting, less squeamish about textures that modern eaters find challenging. The jellied eel inside tonight's aspic was probably caught recently killed, cut into sections and partially cooked before suspension. Eels were standard medieval protein, especially during fasting periods, when their classification as fish made them acceptable. They had the advantage of staying alive in barrels or tanks for weeks, meaning fresh eel was available even far from rivers or coasts. The texture was dense, oily, rich, perfect for aspic because the contrast between firm eel and yielding jelly created interesting mouthfeel. Lower tables receive their portions and you accept yours with curiosity. Up close you can see incredible detail, tiny herb flowers, a sliver of what might be lemon, a few peppercorns suspended like planets in amber space. The first bite is exactly as strange as you expected. Cold, slippery, savoury in an oceanic way. The eel is good, properly cooked, its richness cut by the herbal notes in the jelly. The egg adds a different texture, crumbly against the smooth gelatin. You notice some guests eating their aspic enthusiastically, while others push it around their plates, clearly not fans. Medieval dining included these moments of personal preference, breaking through social obligation. You could serve the most elaborate dish in the world, and someone would still dislike it, though they'd maintain polite fiction rather than insult the host. Think about aspic as preservation technology. Before reliable refrigeration, gelatin offered a way to extend food's edible life. The sealed environment limited bacterial access. The salt and herbs in the stock had preservative qualities. An aspic dish made on Monday might still be safe Wednesday, especially in cool weather. For wealthy households managing large staffs and irregular guest arrivals, preparing dishes that could wait became crucial. Aspic wasn't just beautiful, it was practical. The technique appeared in every medieval cuisine that had access to gelatin sources. French cooks made elaborate aspics with game birds and wine-flavoured jelly. English kitchens favoured fish in clear aspic. Italian recipes sometimes combined meat and fruit in sweet savoury gelatin that sounds bizarre but apparently worked. The principle spread wherever people had bones, patience, and a desire to make food look impressive. Different fish created different jelly qualities. Pike produced particularly clear, firm aspic, so much so that pike was often added to other stock specifically for its gelling power. Sturgeon also worked well. Cheaper fish might produce cloudier, weaker jelly that required more reduction or addition of supplementary gelatin sources. Wealthy households could afford the best fish and longest cooking times, producing aspics so clear you could read through them if anyone had tried. The empty aspic mould gets carried past your section on its way back to the kitchens, and you notice traces of jelly still clinging to its interior, catching light. These moulds were valuable carved wood or fired ceramic shaped into domes, fish castles, anything that would produce interesting forms. Kitchens collected them over years, each one representing both investment and capability. A guest at a nearby table is struggling with his aspic, which has warmed slightly and begun losing structural integrity. The slice is melting on his plate, herbs escaping their gelatin prison, the whole composition collapsing into savoury puddle. He's trying to eat it quickly before total dissolution, spooning gel and ingredients into his mouth with visible urgency. It's somehow both comic and sad, the fate of all aspic in warm environments. Beauty temporary and dependent on temperature. The dogs beneath the tables are more interested in aspic scraps than they were in hedgehog. Maybe the fish appeals to them, or maybe gelatin has natural canine appeal. Several hounds are licking dropped portions with enthusiasm, tongues working to capture every slippery bit. You finish your aspic slice appreciating the craft, even if you're not entirely sold on the experience. It's food that required genuine skill hours of work and understanding of processes that wouldn't be scientifically explained for centuries. Medieval cooks knew gelatin worked without understanding collagen molecular structures. They mastered clarification without microbiology knowledge. They created beauty through empirical experimentation failure and stubborn repetition. A blast from the trumpets announces something significant, and the hall's ambient chaos quiets to anticipatory murmur. The kitchen doors swing open dramatically, and you see firelight beyond them, brighter than torches, dancing and intense. Then the procession enters 4 strong servants carrying a massive platter between them, and on that platter, wreathed in aromatic smoke, sits a boar's head the size of a small child. Its tusks gleam white against dark roasted skin. A polished red apple has been wedged into its mouth, the traditional touch. Rosemary sprigs crown its head like savage greenery, and its eyes, glass replacements surely, because the real ones would have cooked away, seem to stare at nothing and everything. This is the boar's head ceremony, and even though it's not Christmas, that's when this tradition reaches its zenith. The appearance of a boar's head at any feast carries weight. This is ancient protein, wild and dangerous when alive, triumphant and delicious when properly prepared. Boars killed people. They gored hunters, trampled dogs, fought until their last breath, with a ferocity that made them symbols of strength, courage, and untamed masculine power. Eating one's head said we conquered the wild, brought it to your table, transformed violence into feast. The servants parade the boar's head around the perimeter of the hall, giving everyone time to admire it. The preparation must have taken most of a day. First, butchering the massive animal boars could weigh 300 pounds or more, separating the head, cleanly skinning it, or leaving skin on depending on presentation preference. Tonight's head still wears its bristly hide scorched dark during cooking, adding to the primal aesthetic. Then came the actual cooking. The head probably roasted on a specialized spit positioned over coals, basted constantly with lard and wine to keep the meat from drying. Someone had to monitor it for hours, turning it, testing temperatures, making judgment calls about doneness that came from experience rather than thermometers. Medieval cooks developed supernatural abilities to gauge meat temperature by appearance, smell, and the sound of dripping fat. The glazing came last, a mixture that might include honey mustard wine and spices painted onto the hot skin to create that glossy lacquered appearance. The apple insertion was purely theatrical. The rosemary crown was symbolic. The glass eyes were expensive details that elevated the display from impressive to unforgettable. Historians still argue about the boar's head tradition's origins. Some trace it to pagan winter solstice celebrations when killing a boar ensured the sun's return and spring's arrival. Others point to Norse mythology, where warriors feasted on boar in Valhalla, the animal magically regenerating each day for eternal feasting. Christians later absorbed and reinterpreted the tradition. The boar became a symbol of sin, conquered gluttony, transformed into holy celebration wildness, domesticated through faith. The ceremony often included song. At Christmas, feast servers would process while singing the Boar's Head Carol, verses praising the boar, the cook, the Lord who provided it, God who made it all possible. Tonight there's no formal carol, but the musicians play something festive and martial drums and horns, creating a soundtrack of conquest and consumption. The boar's head reaches the high table and gets positioned centrally where everyone can see it. The Lord stands. This is his moment to speak, to contextualize this display. You catch fragments of his address. The boar was killed on his lands 3 days ago. It charged the hunting party. His favourite hound took a tusk, slash but survived. The beast fought until the end, its courage honoured in this presentation. The story contains exaggeration. Certainly noble hunting narratives always do, but the core truth remains: a dangerous animal died so this feast could happen. The carving begins with ceremony matching the arrival. The senior carver approaches with visible reverence. He's probably carved dozens of boar heads, but each one demands fresh respect. The first cut severs one cheek, revealing the dense dark meat underneath. The texture is coarser than pork, the colour deeper, the smell intensely savoury with undertones of the forest. It came from acorns, roots, whatever wild diet the boar maintained. Choice portions go to the higher status guests. Cheek meat is prized tender, despite the boar's tough life, richly flavoured, worth fighting over. The tongue gets extracted and sliced, offered to the lady of the house who accepts it with practised grace. Tongue was delicacy in medieval cuisine, valued for its texture and the skill required to prepare it properly. She takes a ceremonial bite, nods approval, and conversation resumes. You're far enough down the social ladder that boar head meat probably won't reach you. That's fine, you've had plenty of food already. Your plate currently holds aspic remnants and some bread you're using to soak up sauces. But you watch the distribution with interest, noting who receives what. Reading the social dynamics in meat allocation. The boar's tusks get presented to the lord as trophies. He'll mount them somewhere in his hall, his private chambers, maybe gift them to the hunter who made the killing blow. Tusks became heirlooms, proof of successful hunts, conversation pieces that sparked stories. That one I killed that boar in winter of 1448, nearly lost my horse. The beast was enormous. Think about the symbolism layered into this single dish. The boar represented wildness, chaos, the dangerous forest where wolves and bandits lurked. Bringing its head to the table enacted civilization's triumph over nature, human wit over animal strength, domestic safety over wild threat. It also represented the lord's hunting rights, his ownership of forest lands, where peasants couldn't legally hunt, his access to aristocratic pastimes that separated nobility from common folk. The apple in the boar's mouth added another layer, fruit from cultivated orchards, domesticated and sweet, contrasting with the wild meat. Some interpretations suggested the apple represented knowledge, temptation, the Garden of Eden echoing across centuries into medieval dining halls. Others saw simpler meaning apples and pork paired. Well, the fruit's acidity cutting the meat's richness, so why not make the pairing visual and symbolic simultaneously? Children at lower tables are fixated on the boar's head, its tusks, its ferocious appearance softened but not eliminated by cooking. This is probably the closest many of them will come to seeing a wild boar, and certainly the only time they'll see one at a dinner table. The memory will stick. Years later they'll recall the feast, where the boar's head appeared, mixing details, maybe exaggerating its size but preserving the essential wonder of that moment when wildness entered the hall. The carving continues methodically. Jowl meat, earpieces, sections of snout. Everything gets utilized except the skull itself, which will probably end up as dog food or kitchen scrap. Medieval households wasted nothing valuable, and a boar's head contained enough meat to feed dozens if distributed efficiently. You're still processing the boar's head when the next dish arrives, and your brain simply refuses to accept what your eyes are reporting. It's a bird. No, it's a pig. Wait, it's both. The front half is definitely roasted pig, complete with trotters and snout. But where the pig's body should continue, a capon's body takes over, complete with wings and tail feathers. Someone has surgically combined two animals into one impossible creature, stitched them together, roasted the whole chimera, and is now presenting it as if this is perfectly normal dinner fare. This is a cockentrice, and it's exactly as insane as it looks. The name itself is a corruption of cockentrice, the mythical serpent-rooster hybrid that could kill with a glance. Medieval bestiaries described cockatrices in earnest detail alongside real animals, because the line between natural history and folklore was delightfully blurry. If cockatrices existed in books, why not create an edible version? If you could stick a pig and a chicken together, why wouldn't you? Here's the construction process, which required butchery skills that bordered on surgical. First, you killed and cleaned both animals. Then came the precise cutting you needed to divide each carcass at exactly the right point, so the halves would match when joined. Usually this meant cutting both animals roughly at mid-torso, where pig body diameter approximately matched capon body diameter. The measurements had to be close, or you'd end up with obvious gaps or misalignment that would ruin the illusion. Then came the actual joining. Cooks used various methods. Some accounts mention wooden skewers holding the pieces together internally. Others describe careful stitching with kitchen twine. Still others suggest a paste of eggs and flour applied to seal the seam. Whatever technique you used, the goal was structural integrity that would survive roasting without the creature falling apart into its component animals. Once assembled, the cockentrice got seasoned, probably stuffed, because why stop at mere physical impossibility when you could also cram the cavity with breadcrumb mixture fruits and herbs and then roast it on a spit? The cook had to manage different cooking times for pork versus poultry, which meant careful positioning over the fire, possibly uneven heat application, constant monitoring to ensure neither half burned while waiting for the other to finish. The result, when successful, was genuinely impressive. You're looking at it now, the pig half is crispy and golden, the chicken half properly browned, and the seam where they join is disguised. Well enough that from a distance you might believe this creature was born rather than assembled. It's grotesque, it's magnificent, it's completely unnecessary, it's perfect medieval excess. Historians still argue about whether cockentrice was common or rare. Recipe manuscripts mention it, which proves people knew about the concept. But few account books specifically list cockentrice purchases, suggesting it wasn't regular feast fare. More likely it appeared at special occasions when hosts wanted to demonstrate both wealth wasting two animals on one display dish and creativity. It was the medieval equivalent of molecular gastronomy food as art project dinner as conversation starter. The carver approaches, and you can see him calculating his strategy. How do you carve a chimera? Do you treat each half according to its species, or invent new techniques for this hybrid situation? He decides on a pragmatic approach. Pig half gets carved like pork, bird half like poultry, and if guests receive mixed portions, so much the better for spreading the weirdness around. The high table receives servings that include both animals, creating plates that look like taxonomy disasters. Nobles examine their food with expressions ranging from delight to confusion to mild horror. This is food that challenges diners, that forces them to confront the strange creativity of kitchen staff who had too much skill and not enough supervision. But here's the thing, apparently it tastes fine. The pig is pork properly cooked and seasoned. The capon is chicken tender and herbed. They don't magically combine into some new flavour profile just because they've been stitched together. You're essentially eating surf and turf medieval style, except it's land and also different land. Alternative versions existed. Some recipes described the reverse combination chicken front pig rear, which required different cutting and joining techniques, but achieved similar grotesque results. Others mentioned Endor, which involved gilding one half while leaving the other, plain creating visual contrast that emphasized the divided nature. The most ambitious versions combined 3 or more animals, creating increasingly baroque chimeras that eventually collapsed under their own conceptual weight. Think about what this dish represents beyond mere spectacle. Medieval people were obsessed with boundaries between species, between elements, between the earthly and divine. They categorized everything into rigid hierarchies: minerals, plants, animals, humans, angels, God. Creating a cockentrice violated those categories deliberately, playfully. It was transgressive cooking, breaking rules just to demonstrate you could then serving the result to nobles who were supposed to represent order and propriety. The symbolism went deeper. Heraldry used hybrid creatures, constantly griffins, dragons, Yale combinations of lion, eagle, serpent, whatever, that represented family lineages and alliances. A cockentrice on your table echoed that heraldic tradition, suggested your household was creative, powerful, unbound by normal limitations. It said we can make the impossible combine the incompatible, serve you mythology made flesh. Portions reach some lower tables, and you actually receive a piece pig portion, fortunately, because you're not sure how you'd feel about eating part of this monstrosity's chicken half. The meat is good, properly cooked, well spiced. If you didn't know its origin, you'd just think it was excellent roast pork. But you do know, and that knowledge colours every bite. You're eating architectural meat butcher's art, a joke that required hours of work and genuine skill to execute. The dogs under the tables receive mixed scraps, pig and poultry combined, and don't care about species boundaries. They're pragmatists. Meat is meat. The philosophical implications of eating a cockentrice don't trouble canine minds. A guest at the high table is laughing, holding up a piece that contains the seam where pig meets chicken, showing his neighbours the stitching that's now visible without skin to hide it. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Tiny, even stitches that held through hours of cooking. Someone in the kitchen has seamstress skills alongside culinary knowledge, probably a cook's wife or daughter, who contributes expertise without official recognition or payment. You finish your portion and accept more wine, needing something to wash down the lingering cognitive dissonance. You've eaten chimera. You've consumed mythology. Tomorrow, when someone asks what you had for dinner, you'll struggle to explain. Part of a pig that was also part of a chicken sounds like fever dream or bad translation. But tonight in this hall, surrounded by nobles and dogs and birds that escape from pies, it's just another course in a feast that stopped making conventional sense hours ago. The pace of the feast has shifted slightly. You're entering the territory of comfort foods, dishes meant to soothe rather than shock. A server approaches with a large bowl, and the aroma hits you before you see the contents. Something warm, creamy, grainy with undertones of cinnamon and what might be almonds. You're looking at frumenty, one of those medieval staples that appeared at both peasant tables and noble feasts, though the versions differed dramatically in quality and additions. At its simplest, frumenty was wheat porridge whole. Wheat grains boiled in water or milk until they burst and softened into thick, creamy consistency. Peasants ate it plain, or with whatever scraps they could add. But noble frumenty was another creature entirely. The wheat got boiled in almond milk instead of water sweetened with honey or sugar spiced with cinnamon and saffron, until it glowed golden, enriched with egg yolks to create custard-like richness. And then, because this is a noble feast and restraint is for Lent, they added venison. Yes, venison. Deer meat roasted separately and then shredded or cubed into the sweet-spiced porridge. The combination sounds bizarre to modern palates trained to separate sweet from savoury, dessert from main course. But medieval cuisine loved these hybrid dishes that straddled categories that combined cream and meat, honey and game comfort and luxury. The frumenty arrives at the high table, first served in individual bowls rather than communal platters. This is intimate food meant to be eaten with spoons, slowly allowing the warmth and texture to work their soothing magic. You watch nobles bend over their bowls, steam rising to their faces, expressions softening as they eat. After hours of spectacle and performance, frumenty offers something gentler nourishment that doesn't demand applause. The wheat grains in proper frumenty required extensive preparation, Cooks would crack whole wheat, this was before refined flour dominated, and soak it overnight, sometimes longer, to soften the kernels. Then came hours of gentle simmering, stirring regularly to prevent sticking, adding liquid as needed. The goal was wheat that maintained some texture while releasing enough starch to create creaminess. Getting this balance right required experience and attention that modern instant oats have made us forget. Almond milk added expense and flavour. Making it meant grinding blanched almonds with water, then straining through cloth to extract creamy liquid that approximated dairy milk but kept better in warm weather and qualified as acceptable during fasting periods. Wealthy households made almond milk fresh daily. Less wealthy ones bought it from specialists or used cow's milk and hoped no one cared about fasting technicalities. The venison swimming in tonight's frumenty probably came from the Lord's deer park in closed land, where deer roamed in semi-captivity maintained for hunting and eating. Deer meat was status food, legally restricted, another way of announcing that this household had hunting rights and aristocratic privilege. The meat got roasted first, then shredded while still warm, so it could absorb the frumenty's flavours while contributing its own rich gamey notes. Historians still argue about whether sweet-savoury combinations like frumenty with venison reflected genuine medieval preference, or just practical kitchen management using one pot to create filling, impressive food that showcased expensive ingredients. Probably both. Medieval cooks worked with different flavour paradigms than modern ones. They didn't automatically separate sweet and savoury into opposing categories. Honey-enhanced meat. Fruit paired with fowl. Sugar appeared in fish dishes. These combinations made sense to palates trained from childhood to accept them. The frumenty reaches lower tables, including yours. Your portion contains less venison than the high table received, a few token pieces floating in the golden porridge, but the base is rich and satisfying. The first spoonful warms you from the inside, the wheat's texture substantial, but not heavy. The spices creating complexity that develops as you chew. The venison pieces are tender, their gamey flavour mellowed by the sweet porridge, creating a combination that's strange but somehow works. Think about frumenty's versatility across the social spectrum. Peasants ate it as survival food, cheap grain made palatable through cooking, filling bellies cheaply. Monasteries served it during fasts using almond milk and omitting meat to maintain purity. Nobles transformed it into luxury, adding every expensive ingredient they could source. The dish scaled perfectly from subsistence to extravagance while maintaining its essential identity. The texture is what really defines frumenty, that particular mouthfeel of burst wheat grains, suspended in creamy liquid somewhere between soup and porridge, requiring a spoon but substantial enough to satisfy. Modern equivalents might be risotto or congee, though neither quite captures frumenty's medieval character. This is food that predates those refinements, that comes from a time when wheat was precious, and transforming it into something delicious mattered deeply. You noticed nobles eating slowly, methodically, conversation quieting, as people focus on their bowls. Frumenty has this effect, it's contemplative food, warming and filling in ways that promote drowsiness rather than excitement. After the cockentrice and the exploding pie and the gilded everything, this simpler dish, even enriched with venison and spices, feels like permission to slow down to just eat, rather than perform eating. The dogs beneath the tables are begging for frumenty scraps, which surprises you slightly. You'd think the sweet elements would discourage them, but apparently the venison content makes it appealing. Servants toss down spoonfuls occasionally, and the hounds lap them up eagerly, wheat grain sticking to their muzzles. Different regions had frumenty variations that reflected local resources and preferences. Northern areas sometimes added dried fruit raisins, currants, chopped figs, creating even sweeter versions. Coastal regions occasionally included fish instead of or alongside meat, creating combinations that sound increasingly experimental. Some recipes mentioned adding rose water at the end, perfuming the dish with floral notes that complemented the almond milk. The warming quality went beyond mere temperature. Medieval medicine believed certain foods produced heat within the body, not thermal heat, but elemental warmth that affected your humoral balance. Wheat was temperate, neither too hot nor too cold. Adding warming spices like cinnamon and ginger shifted it toward heat production, making frumenty ideal for cold weather feasts. The venison also carried warming properties. Together, the dish was supposed to generate internal heat that sustained you through winter nights. You scrape the last wheat grains from your bowl, realizing you've eaten more than you intended. Frumenty has that quality. It's so comforting, so satisfying in a fundamental way, that you keep eating even when full. The sweetness doesn't cloy because the wheat and meat ground it. The richness doesn't overwhelm because the texture stays light despite the cream and eggs. A servant collects empty bowls, and you notice several guests requesting seconds, something you haven't seen much tonight despite the abundance. Most dishes were about spectacle and tasting sampling rather than fully eating, but frumenty invites actual consumption, genuine appetite rather than social performance. It's one of the few dishes tonight that would taste just as good eaten alone in a quiet kitchen as it does here in this crowded, noisy hall. A murmur ripples through the hall, starting at the high table and spreading outward like water rings. You crane your neck to see what's causing the reaction, and they're being carried with unusual care by servers wearing what look like leather gloves is a platter, bearing creatures that shouldn't be food. They're eel-like but worse primitive-looking, with circular mouths full of concentric rings of teeth. No jaws, just sucker mouths designed for latching onto other fish and rasping away their flesh. These are lampreys, and they're one of the most prized delicacies in medieval cuisine despite or perhaps because of their genuinely horrifying appearance. Lampreys! The fish that supposedly killed King Henry II of England. The story circulated widely in 1135 the king ate a surfeit of lampreys against his physician's advice and died shortly after. Whether the lampreys actually caused his death, or just provided convenient timing for poison assassination, or natural causes dressed up as culinary excess, nobody knows. But the tale stuck, giving lampreys a dangerous glamour that only increased their appeal to nobles who loved courting risk in every form, including dinner. The creatures on tonight's platter have been prepared in lamprey pie, a rich, complex construction, involving wine spices and the lampreys themselves cooked until tender in a sauce that's almost black with reduced wine and blood. Yes, blood. Lamprey blood was crucial to the dish, providing iron-rich thickness and a flavour that was intense, primal, somehow both marine and earthy at once. The preparation process was elaborate and slightly gruesome. Live lampreys they kept better alive until cooking time got killed and bled carefully, the blood reserved in containers. The bodies were cleaned, which involved dealing with that tooth-ringed mouth and the slime coating that made them slippery as wet rope. Some cooks scalded them briefly to remove slime. Others embraced it as part of the lamprey experience. Then came the cooking. Lampreys simmered in wine, usually red, often the good stuff, because this dish demanded quality, with onions, herbs, spices, and eventually their own blood stirred back in. The blood both thickened the sauce and intensified the flavour, creating something that looked almost like chocolate sauce, but tasted of wine iron and ancient waters. The lampreys cooked until tender, but not falling apart, maintaining their distinctive shape. Finally, everything got assembled into pies. The lampreys coiled in the pastry coffin sauce, poured over them crusts sealed and baked. The result was portable lamprey travelling delicacy pie that announced your status because lampreys cost fortune and came from specific rivers where they spawned in dwindling numbers even in medieval times. You watch the high table receive servings. The pies get opened, revealing the dark sauce and the coiled lampreys inside, and nobles attack them with enthusiasm despite the creature's appearance. Or maybe because of it eating something that looks parasitic and predatory, carried its own appeal, proved you'd sophisticated enough palate to appreciate food that intimidated others. Historians still argue about why medieval nobles loved lampreys so intensely. The flavour was certainly distinctive, rich, complex, unlike any other fish. The texture was unique, too dense and meaty despite being fish with none of the flakiness of cod or sole. But surely some of the appeal was status and rarity. Lampreys came from specific rivers during specific seasons. Getting fresh lampreys to inland castles required planning expense and connections. Serving them proved all three. The religious classification helped too. Like our friend the porpoise earlier, lampreys qualified as fish for fasting purposes despite their blood and their vampiric feeding habits. You could eat expensive, filling meat-like lamprey during Lent and maintain technical piety. Medieval people appreciated these loopholes the way modern people appreciate tax deductions, grateful for benefits that felt slightly illicit, but were perfectly legal. The taste was famously polarizing. Supporters praised lampreys as the finest fish available, worthy of kings, quite literally as English monarchs regularly received lamprey tributes from certain towns. Detractors found them slimy, too rich, too bloody, too reminiscent of their parasitic nature. The lamprey's appearance didn't help even cooked and sauced. They looked alien, prehistoric, like something that should have gone extinct but stubbornly persisted. Think about that Henry story for a moment. Whether or not lampreys actually killed him, the fact that everyone believed they could said something about medieval understanding of food and health. Rich dishes eaten in excess could kill you. That wasn't superstition. It was observation. Wealthy people did sometimes eat themselves to death, overloading systems with fat, protein, salt, and richness that their bodies couldn't process. Lampreys became the symbol of this danger, the dish that could murder you with pleasure. The lamprey pies at tonight's feast are probably safer than whatever Henry I ate. They're fresh, properly prepared, served in reasonable portions. But the frisson of danger remains. Every noble taking a bite is on some level performing bravery. They're eating the king-killer fish. They're courting the same fate that took down royalty. And they're surviving it, proving their constitutions are strong, their digestions robust, their relationship with excess perfectly calibrated. You're not getting lamprey at your table position. This is purely high-status food, too expensive and rare to distribute widely. That's fine, the aspic and frumenty filled you adequately, and you're not sure you'd want to eat something with concentric rings of teeth anyway, cooked or not. But you watch the high table with interest, noting which nobles eat enthusiastically, and which pick tentatively at their portions. The sauce is apparently spectacular. Multiple guests request extra sauce for their bread, using trenchers to soak up the wine blood reduction. That sauce probably took hours to achieve its thickness and complexity-reducing wine, until it became almost syrupy, tempering in blood, without curdling it, balancing the lamprey's richness with acidity and spice. It's craftsmanship in a bowl skill transformed into something you could theoretically pour over ice cream if you were mad enough. Medieval recipe collections treated lamprey preparation with unusual respect. Instructions were detailed, warnings were included, alternatives were rare. You didn't substitute other fish in lamprey dishes. The whole point was lampreys specifically, their unique characteristics, their status. Making lamprey pie with pike would be like using cubic zirconia in a crown. Technically possible, but missing the entire point. The empty pie crusts get cleared away, and you notice they're thick, sturdy. These weren't meant for eating, but for containing. They've done their job, held the lampreys and sauce through baking without leaking or collapsing, and now they'll probably feed servants or dogs or get discarded. Medieval pastry often served architectural rather than culinary purposes, especially for elaborate dishes where the crust was just an edible cooking vessel. A noble at the high table dabs sauce from his beard with a cloth napkin, looking satisfied and slightly dangerous, like he's just wrestled a small predator and won. Which in a sense he has. Lampreys might not fight back when cooked, but eating them still feels like conquest, like consuming something wild and parasitic and transforming it into aristocratic pleasure. The servers return from the kitchens carrying bowls and small pitchers, and the aroma shifts dramatically sharper, more complex layers of flavour announcing themselves before you can see their source. These are the sauces, the medieval kitchen's secret weapons, and they're arriving now to accompany dishes or be served as courses themselves. You're about to experience Cameline Jant's verjuice preparations and other concoctions that medieval diners considered essential, that transformed simple roasted meat into something worthy of noble tables. Cameline sauce arrives first, dark brown and thick as mud, smelling of cinnamon, ginger and vinegar. The name supposedly comes from its camel brown colour, though you suspect medieval people had never seen actual camels and were working from description or imagination. The sauce contains breadcrumbs for thickening bread, was medieval cornstarch, the universal thickener soaked in vinegar or wine, then mixed with ground cinnamon ginger, possibly cloves and maybe some liver or blood to deepen the colour and add richness. A servant ladles camelin over a plate of roasted mutton at the high table, and the transformation is immediate. What was simple meat becomes glazed complex, visually enhanced. The dark sauce catches. Torchlight makes the mutton look more expensive than it probably was. That's partly the point. Sauces elevated everyday proteins, made chicken taste special, turned last week's venison into tonight's delicacy. The flavour profile of cameline is aggressive by modern standards, sweet from cinnamon sharp, from vinegar, warm from ginger, all in concentrations that would make contemporary diners blink and reach for water. But medieval palates loved intensity. They wanted flavours that announced themselves, that fought with each other in your mouth, and somehow achieved harmony through sheer force of personality. Jant's sauce follows paler, more refined, made with ginger, as the primary spice. The name comes from the old French gingembre. This sauce uses white bread and white wine or chicken stock, keeping everything pale and elegant. Ginger gets ground fine and mixed in along with sometimes cinnamon, sometimes white pepper. The result is sharp and warming, but visually subtle, appropriate for fish or white meats where dark sauces would look wrong. You watch a noble receive pike in Jant sauce, the fish's pale flesh, almost disappearing under the thick coating. He cuts into it, takes a bite, and you can tell from his expression that the ginger is powerful. His eyes widen slightly. He reaches for wine, but he's also nodding approval. This is food that challenges you, that makes eating an active experience rather than passive consumption. Verjuice appears next, not exactly a sauce, but a cooking liquid and acid component made from unripe grapes or crab apples, incredibly sour, used the way modern cooks use lemon juice, but more aggressively. Medieval recipes call for verjuice constantly. Boil in verjuice, serve with verjuice, add verjuice to taste. The sour intensity cut through fat-balanced rich meats provided acidity that medieval cooking valued highly. Tonight's verjuice gets served as a dipping sauce, probably mixed with herbs and maybe some honey to temper its ferocity. Guests use bread to sop it up their faces, registering the intensity-pursed lips, squinting eyes followed by satisfied expressions as the sourness works its magic on palates tired from rich foods. This is medieval palate cleanser aggressive reset button between courses, or even between bites. Historians still argue about whether these extreme sauces reflected medieval flavour preferences or practical necessity. Did they genuinely love cinnamon vinegar combinations, or were they masking meat that was on the edge of turning? The masking spoilage theory mostly fails. As mentioned earlier, nobles could afford fresh meat, and spoiled meat made you sick regardless of sauce. More likely, they just enjoyed robust flavours that modern palates find overwhelming. Think about the labour involved in making these sauces. Someone ground spices by hand using mortar and pestle, working for hours to achieve fine powder from hard cinnamon bark or dried ginger root. Someone toasted and ground bread into uniform crumbs. Someone stirred constantly while ingredients combined, adjusting consistency, tasting and retasting, until the balance satisfied the head cook's standards. These sauces represented hours of work, pounds of expensive spices and skill developed over years of training. Medieval sauce theory was elaborate. Different sauces suited different meats, fish seasons, even diners' humoral constitutions. Cold, moist fish needed hot, dry sauces to achieve balance. Hot, dry roasted meats benefited from cool, moist preparations. Young people with naturally hot constitutions should avoid the warmest spices. Old people needed extra heat. The system was pseudoscience, but it was elaborate, consistent pseudoscience that gave cooks framework for decision-making. A server passes your section with a bowl of what looks like mustard sauce yellow, thick nose clearing even from a distance. Medieval mustard was brutal, made from crushed mustard seeds mixed with vinegar or verjuice, no tempering, no mercy. People used it on everything, apparently enjoying the sinus-clearing, eye-watering intensity. You managed to secure a small portion on bread, and the first taste is exactly as violent as you expected. Heat that goes straight to your nasal passage's sharpness, that makes your eyes water, followed by a surprisingly pleasant aftertaste once the assault fades. Regional variations multiplied these basic sauces into dozens of variants. French courts preferred their sauces smooth and refined. English kitchens made theirs chunkier, more textured. Italian recipes incorporated exotic elements: pomegranate molasses, pine nuts, unusual herbs. German sauce traditions leaned sour, using huge amounts of vinegar and verjuice. Each region thought their approach was obviously correct and everyone else was doing it wrong. The expense of good sauce rivaled the meat it accompanied. A single batch of proper camelin made with sufficient cinnamon and ginger could cost what a labourer earned in several days. Households that served these sauces liberally were advertising wealth and kitchen sophistication. The message was clear: we don't just roast meat and serve it plain like peasants, we transform it, enhance it, make it worthy of your refined palates. You notice nobles at the high table requesting specific sauces by name, showing off their knowledge of proper pairings. Camelin for the goose, if you please. Does this capon have jants? Their performing expertise demonstrating that they understand food at a level beyond mere eating. This is cuisine as cultural capital, flavour knowledge as status marker. The dogs beneath the tables are deeply suspicious of sauces. They'll eat plain meat enthusiastically, but sauced scraps get sniffed carefully, sometimes rejected entirely. Dogs apparently draw the line at concentrated cinnamon vinegar preparations, showing more restraint than some of the humans above them. A final sauce arrives, green sauce made from herbs pounded with vinegar bread and possibly some garlic. It's bright fresh, cutting through the parade of brown and yellow sauces like a spring breeze through a stuffy room. The colour alone is refreshing, and the taste when a generous noble shares a portion that drifts to your table is surprisingly bright and modern, feeling more recognisable to contemporary palates than most of tonight's flavours. A strange rhythmic sound emerges from somewhere near the kitchens, a steady trotting, almost mechanical, accompanied by the creak of wood and the occasional frustrated whine. You turn toward the noise, confused, and then you see it a large wooden wheel mounted vertically near the kitchen entrance, and inside it running steadily like a furry hamster is a dog. Not a pet, not a hound lounging under tables, a working dog bred specifically for this purpose, running in the wheel to turn a spit where massive joints of meat rotate slowly over the fire. This is a turnspit dog, and you're watching medieval kitchen technology that's somehow both ingenious and deeply uncomfortable. The dogs were real purpose-bred over generations for this specific job. They were small, sturdy, long-bodied with short legs. The proportions supposedly helped them run efficiently in the wheel's confined space. Some had slightly crooked legs from years of running. All had the resigned expression of workers who understand their lot and accept it without enthusiasm. They were called vernepater cur in some regions, literally the dog that turns the wheel, and they were as much kitchen equipment as the pots and knives. The wheel mechanism was simple but effective. The dog ran inside the wheel like a treadmill, and the wheel's rotation connected via gears or belts to the spit mechanism. As the dog ran, the spit turned, ensuring meat cooked evenly without requiring a human to stand there cranking for hours. It was automation via animal labour, the medieval version of a rotisserie motor. You watch the current dog, a brownish creature with knowing eyes, maintain its steady pace. Every so often it glances toward the kitchens, possibly hoping for relief, or maybe just checking on the meat's progress. The heat from the nearby fires must be intense. The smoke must sting its eyes. But it keeps running because that's what turnspit dogs did day after day, feast after feast. The practice seems cruel by modern standards, and honestly it probably was cruel by medieval standards too. They just cared less about canine comfort than meat quality. But consider the alternative, a human doing this job. Kitchen boys traditionally turned spits before turnspit dogs became common, standing for hours in smoke and heat turning handles until their arms ached, breathing in fat smoke occasionally getting burned by spattering grease. Was using a dog instead more humane or less? The question doesn't have comfortable answers. Historians still argue about exactly when turnspit dogs became common and how widespread the practice was. Evidence suggests they were most popular in England, where they became almost iconic fixtures of large kitchens by the Tudor period. Continental European kitchens used them less frequently, preferring human labour or mechanical alternatives like weighted pulleys. The dogs appear in manuscripts, paintings, account books, enough documentation to confirm they were real common and considered completely normal by people who used them. The breeds eventually died out. As mechanical spits became available, clockwork mechanisms, then eventually electric motors, turnspit dogs lost their purpose. The last documented turnspit dog died sometime in the early 20th century, ending a lineage that had existed for centuries purely to turn meat over fires. It's one of those bits of history that makes you grateful for technological progress, even as you feel retrospective guilt about the countless dogs who spent their lives running in wheels. Tonight's dog gets relief. After what must be 30 minutes or so, a handler approaches. With a fresh dog, stops the wheel, switches them out. The tired dog emerges stiffly, is given water and a scrap of meat, then retires to some corner to rest before its next shift. The replacement dog enters the wheel with visible reluctance but no actual resistance. This is its job. It knows the routine. Think about the efficiency calculation here. Feeding and maintaining a turnspit dog cost less than paying human labour for the same hours. The dog didn't complain, didn't demand breaks beyond physical necessity, didn't steal food or drink on the job, well, probably couldn't reach it from inside the wheel. From a purely economic standpoint, turnspit dogs made sense, which is why they persisted for so long despite their somewhat disturbing nature. The meat currently being rotated by dog power is probably one of the evening's later courses, a massive roast, possibly beef, gleaming with fat and juice. It's been cooking for hours, the wheel turning continuously, ensuring every surface receives equal heat. The result will be perfectly cooked, evenly browned, crispy skinned meat that guests will praise without thinking about how that perfection was achieved. Some households used multiple dogs in shifts, cycling them through the wheel to prevent exhaustion. Others pushed single dogs for extended periods with predictably cruel results. The variation probably depended on the head cook's temperament, the household's wealth, and how much anyone cared about dog welfare. Given medieval attitudes toward animal suffering which ranged from indifferent to actively entertained by it, many turnspit dogs probably had miserable lives. But some accounts suggest the dogs were valued, even cherished in a utilitarian way. They were part of the kitchen staff, fed regularly, housed in the warm kitchen rather than outside. Some supposedly attended church with their owners on Sundays, the one day they didn't work. The church even had a special day, St. Hubert's Day, where turnspit dogs received blessings alongside hunting hounds, acknowledging their service in their own humble way. The mechanical sound continues, the wheels creak, the dogs panting the spit's rotation. It's become background noise like the hall's conversation, and the musicians playing just another element of the feast's auditory landscape. Most guests probably don't even notice it, don't think about how their perfectly roasted meat achieved that perfection. The labour, whether human or canine, that enables luxury usually remains invisible to luxury's consumers. You find yourself watching the dog more than the meat, noting its technique. This steady pace, the way it occasionally shifts positions slightly to rest different muscles, the brief pause when the handler isn't looking, where it slows just slightly before resuming proper speed. The dog has personality intelligence, is solving the problem of making its job more bearable within the constraints it can't escape. Medieval kitchens were full of such contraptions, mechanical advantage applied to cooking problems often in ways that seem bizarre or cruel now. Bellows for stoking fires, elaborate pulley systems for lifting heavy pots, specialized tools for every possible kitchen task, many of them powered by the lowest members of the household hierarchy, children, servants, animals. The turnspit dog was just the most visible and, to modern eyes, most disturbing example of this approach. The meat comes off the spit, finally carried to carving stations, and the wheel stops. The dog inside settles immediately into rest position, lying down but staying alert, waiting to see if another roast will require its services. For now it gets to rest, lick its paws, exist without running. Small mercies in a working dog's life. The evening shifts towards sweeter territory. Servants bring out platters that shimmer pale in the torchlight, carrying the distinctive smell of almonds and sugar. These are marchpane sculptures, what later centuries will call marzipan, and they represent some of the most elaborate confectionery work in the medieval repertoire. Tonight's offerings include a miniature castle about a foot tall, several heraldic animals, and what appears to be a remarkably detailed rose in full bloom, each petal individually shaped and positioned. Marchpane was expensive luxury, requiring 2 costly ingredients in abundance: almonds and sugar. We've already seen sugar in the massive subtlety castle earlier, but marchpane took sugar in a different direction, mixing it with ground almonds to create a paste that could be moulded, sculpted, painted, and transformed into edible art that was actually pleasant to eat, unlike purely decorative sugar sculptures. The process started with blanched almonds, skinned by scalding in hot water, then meticulously peeled by hand. These almonds got ground into powder finest possible consistency using mortars and pestles, in a process that turned your arms to jelly and took hours. Any remaining chunks or coarse pieces would ruin the final texture, so the grinding had to be thorough, obsessive perfect. Then came the sugar, also ground fine, mixed with the almond powder in proportions that varied by recipe and desired consistency. Some marchpane was firm, almost hard, suitable for sculptures that needed to hold elaborate shapes. Other preparations were softer, more like modern marzipan, pleasant to bite and chew. Medieval confectioners adjusted ratios based on purpose, using experience and intuition more than measurement. Rose water often got added a few precious drops that perfumed the mixture and helped bind it together. The result was a pale, sweet-smelling paste that could be rolled, moulded to shaped and sculpted like clay. Except this clay cost a fortune and tasted of almonds and flowers and concentrated wealth. You watch as servants present the marchpane castle to the high table, its architectural achievement in miniature towers with tiny windows battlements. You could count individual merlins on even a portcullis that appears functional, though it's solid almond paste. Someone spent days on this, possibly a specialized confectioner brought in specifically for the feast, working with tools fine enough for jewelry, making coaxing marchpane into shapes it didn't naturally want to hold. The animals get distributed to various nobles. A lion for the lord naturally painted gold with vegetable dyes. A falcon for the lady detailed enough that you can see individual feathers suggested in the surface texture. A boar for a hunting-obsessed guest who laughs with delight at the recognition. These aren't just treats, they're personalized gifts, edible tokens of esteem that guests will either eat immediately or preserve as mementos until they eventually harden, crack, or attract vermin. Historians still argue about marchpane's origins. Some trace it to Middle Eastern confectionery traditions brought back by crusaders or traders who encountered similar almond sugar preparations in Arabic cuisine. Others suggest independent European development, pointing to almond cultivation in Mediterranean regions and medieval Europe's obsession with finding new ways to display wealth through food. Probably multiple traditions converged each culture, adding refinements until marchpane became the elaborate art form visible tonight. The rose is extraordinary up close. You get a view as servants carry it past your section. Each petal curves naturally painted with diluted berry juice to create subtle pink gradations from pale at the edges to deeper colour at the centre. The stem has thorns, tiny projections of hardened marchpane that look sharp but probably couldn't break skin. Leaves attach at botanically correct positions. This is someone who studied actual roses, who understood their structure well enough to recreate it in almond paste. The taste is intensely sweet. When marchpane pieces finally reach lower tables, you manage to secure a fragment possibly from the castle's outer wall. The texture is dense, almost creamy, dissolving slowly on your tongue. The almond flavour is pronounced, the sugar is abundant, and the rose water adds that distinctive floral note that medieval confections loved. It's pleasant in small amounts but would be overwhelming in quantity, which is probably fine because quantity isn't the point. These are meant to be savoured, nibbled, appreciated as much for artistry as flavour. Think about marchpane as statement. Like gold leaf-like sugar sculptures, these creations existed primarily to demonstrate capability and resources. The almonds came from southern Europe or imported from further away. The sugar travelled impossible distances. The labour was specialised and expensive. Serving elaborate marchpane told guests we have international trade connections, disposable income access to skilled artisans, and enough confidence to turn expensive ingredients into temporary art. but unlike purely decorative sugar marchpane, had dual purpose, beautiful and edible sculpture and dessert art you could eventually consume. This made it more accessible, less purely wasteful, though still extravagant by any reasonable standard. A noble could admire her falcon sculpture all evening, then eat it the next day, experiencing both aesthetic and gustatory pleasure from the same object. Different regions developed signature marchpane specialties. Italian confectioners created elaborate narrative scenes, the nativity, classical myths, historical battles using coloured marchpane like a three-dimensional painting medium. German traditions favoured geometric shapes and intricate patterns. English marchpane often took heraldic forms, coats of arms rendered in edible detail. Each tradition claimed superiority while borrowing techniques from others. The marchpane castle is being carefully disassembled at the high table. The Lord himself breaks off a tower and eats it symbolically, consuming his own fortifications, which carries meaning you're probably too tired to fully analyse. Other guests receive tower fragments, wall sections, tiny marchpane windows that served no structural purpose but looked impressive. The castle becomes memory as it's consumed, which is somehow appropriate. Medieval feasts were ephemeral by nature, existing to be destroyed, remembered rather than preserved. You notice children at lower tables are fascinated by the marchpane animals being passed around. Most have never seen such things. Sugar sculptures and marchpane creations don't appear at typical meals even in wealthy households. This is special occasion, feast food, the kind of thing you remember decades later when recalling childhood wonders. One girl receives a small marchpane bird and holds it reverently, clearly torn between eating it immediately and trying to keep it forever. The rose gets presented to the lady of the house, who accepts it with genuine pleasure. You can see her face light up, the performance dropping for a moment into authentic delight. She examines it closely, touching petals gently, then places it beside her plate where she can continue admiring it. Tomorrow she'll probably eat it or share it with her ladies-in-waiting or try to preserve it, but tonight it's just beautiful, a moment of grace in an evening of excess. Medieval confectioners who mastered marchpane could command impressive wages, travelling between noble households employed for special occasions, building reputations that attracted wealthy patrons. Some became minor celebrities, their creations discussed and compared, their techniques jealously guarded or stolen by ambitious apprentices. The best could support themselves entirely through confectionery work, which was remarkable in an era when most people's economic options were severely limited. A different kind of platter arrives now, and the smell announces it. Before you see the contents, earthy, rich, slightly metallic, unmistakably organ meat. This is Umble's what will eventually become humble pie in both literal and metaphorical senses, and tonight it's being served at the lower tables, while the high table receives, well, you're not entirely sure what they're eating, but it's definitely not organ meat. Umbles, also called numbles, referred to the internal organs of deer, heart, liver, kidneys, sometimes tongue and other bits that came from inside the animal rather than being muscle meat. After a successful hunt, the venison proper, the haunches, loins, choice cuts went to the lord and his high-status guests. The organs went to everyone else, servants, huntsmen, lower-ranking household members and guests who didn't rate premium meat. The distinction was absolute and visible. At tonight's feast you can see it playing out in real time. The high table is eating venison, proper cuts, roasted and glazed, served with ceremony. You and everyone at your level of the hall are eating Umble's pie, those same deer organs chopped and stewed with onions, herbs and thick gravy sealed in pastry crust that are actually meant to be eaten, unlike some of tonight's architectural coffins. The phrase, eating humble pie, will eventually emerge from this practice, though the linguistic journey is roundabout. Umble's becomes Numbles becomes humble, and the association with low status with eating the less desirable parts while others feast on prime cuts becomes metaphorical. To eat humble pie means to accept lower status, to acknowledge your place in the hierarchy, to literally consume your subordination. But here's the thing about umbles that complicates the narrative properly prepared. Organ meat is delicious. The pie you're currently eating is rich, deeply savoury complex in ways that simple muscle meat can't match. The liver provides sweetness and iron intensity. The heart is dense and beefy. The kidneys add their characteristic mineral depth. Together, stewed slowly with good wine and herbs, they create flavour that's actually superior to plain roasted venison, though you'd never say that out loud in this hall. Medieval people understood organ meat's value even as they assigned it lower social status. Liver was prized in medical contexts, full of blood and vital humours, good for strengthening weak constitutions. Heart was symbolically powerful centre of courage and emotion, worth eating for its metaphysical properties. Kidneys filtered impurities, which made them, well, medical theory got confused about whether that made them purifying or contaminated. The practical reality was simpler. A deer had limited prime cuts but substantial organ meat. If you killed a deer, and only the Lord's table ate it, you wasted food that could feed dozens. Umbles solved this problem efficiently. The hierarchy remained visible and enforced, but everyone got fed. Protein was distributed throughout the household, and nothing valuable went to waste. You watch a servant carry a massive venison haunch past your table, toward the high table, and yeah, it looks better than your umble's pie, more impressive, more obviously luxurious. But you're eating well, your belly is full of rich meat and good gravy, and honestly the organs probably have more flavour and nutrition than that fancy roast, even if they lack visual drama. Historians still argue about whether eating humble pie carried genuine shame or was just acknowledged hierarchy. Servants and lower-ranking folks ate umbles regularly. It was expected normal part of the social contract. Did they feel humiliated by it, or just accept it as the way things worked? Probably depended on individual temperament and how badly they were treated otherwise. Food hierarchy stung more when paired with other forms of degradation, less when it was just practical resource distribution in a world of limited plenty. The pastry crust on your umble's pie is actually good, flaky, buttery, substantial enough to hold the filling, but tender enough to eat without jaw fatigue. Someone in the kitchens made this properly, didn't just slap together scraps for the lower tables. That matters. The difference between institutional food made with contempt versus made with professional pride shows in every bite. Think about all the phrases English inherited from medieval food practices: upper crust for aristocracy, from the top crust of bread being saved for nobles, salad days from youth and inexperience when you ate cheap greens rather than expensive meat. Bring home the bacon from fairs where catching a greased pig won you meat, and humble pie from this exact situation eating organ meat while watching others feast on prime cuts. Language preserves these hierarchies long after the practices fade. You probably say eating humble pie without thinking about medieval deer organs, just like people say upper crust, without connecting it to bread trenchers. The metaphors persist, carrying medieval social structures forward through centuries embedded in everyday speech. The dogs beneath the tables are delighted with umble scraps. They don't care about meat. Hierarchy don't recognise the social implications of liver versus loin. To them, organ meat is possibly better than muscle meat, richer and more interesting. Several hounds are fighting over dropped kidney pieces, snarling and snapping with enthusiasm that suggest umbles shouldn't be considered inferior food at all. More platters arrive with additional organ preparations, tongue sliced thin and served cold in aspic that actually looks impressive. the neat slices suspended in amber jelly creating geometric patterns, tripe stewed until tender with onions and milk, comfort food that appears across European cuisines in various forms, sweetbreads, thymus, and pancreas glands fried crispy, and served with sharp sauce, genuinely delicious if you can get past knowing what they are. Organ meat cuisine was sophisticated across medieval Europe. French cooks made elaborate pâté from liver and other organs. Italian kitchens created financiera mixed organ stews flavoured with wine and herbs. Spanish recipes featured blood sausages and organ terrines. English umble's pie was just one expression of continent-wide traditions that valued every part of the animal and developed techniques to make each part delicious. Modern cuisine mostly abandoned this approach, at least in English-speaking countries. Organ meat became offal, literally offal, the bits that fall off during butchering and culturally demoted to poverty food or ethnic specialties. But medieval people were right, these parts are flavourful, nutritious and perfectly good eating when prepared with skill and attention. Your umble's pie is gone, plate empty, except for some remaining gravy you're soaking up with bread. You're satisfied, well-fed, possibly even grateful to be eating organ meat rather than another gilded overspiced spectacle dish. The high table can keep their roasted venison haunch. You've eaten humble pie, and it was actually pretty great. A servant clears your plate and you notice he's eating scraps quickly as he works. Probably his only chance to eat during the feast service. He snags a piece of someone's leftover umbles and swallows it gratefully. Even here at the lower tables, you're higher in the hierarchy than the servants who serve you. It's hierarchies all the way down each level, eating slightly worse cuts, until you reach the kitchen dogs gnawing bones outside. The feast is entering its final phase, and the drinks are shifting from water and table wine to something more elaborate, more ceremonial. Servants are heating wine at the kitchen fires, and the aromas drifting into the hall are no longer just food. They're pharmacy, perfume, spice market, all concentrated into liquid form. This is Hippocras, the medieval spiced wine that appears at feast endings, and it's accompanied by other elaborate drinks designed to aid digestion, warm the body, and send guests home in a pleasant haze. Hippocras named, supposedly after Hippocrates, the ancient physician, though the connection is dubious, was wine transformed into medicine and luxury simultaneously. The base was good wine, red or white, depending on preference and what needed using. Into this went cinnamon, ginger, long pepper, grains of paradise, sometimes cloves, always sugar or honey, in quantities that made the drink almost syrupy. The mixture steeped together, then got strained repeatedly through cloth bags, the famous Hippocrates sleeve, until it ran clear and aromatic, more perfume than beverage. The high table receives Hippocras in special cups, sometimes chilled in snow, if the season and storage permit other times served warm, depending on medical theory and the weather. The drink was expensive, all those spices cost fortunes, and serving it generously announced that this feast spared no expense, literally to the last drop. You watch nobles receive their cups with visible pleasure. Hippocras was popular, genuinely enjoyed rather than just endured for status. The sweetness masked wine's harsher qualities, the spices created complex flavours that evolved as you drank, and the alcohol content unchanged from the base wine ensured pleasant intoxication that could be blamed on medicine rather than mere drunkenness. Medical theory justified Hippocras enthusiastically. Wine was considered hot and dry in humoral terms. The spices amplified these qualities, making Hippocras especially suitable for cold, damp constitutions or cold weather. The drink supposedly aided digestion after heavy meals, warming the stomach and helping it process all that meat and fat and excess. Whether it actually helped, or just made you too drunk to notice digestive distress, is arguable, but people believed in its efficacy. Different recipes existed for different purposes. Some hippocras emphasized cinnamon for cardiovascular benefits. Others loaded up on ginger for digestive heat. Wealthy households maintained multiple varieties, selecting appropriate versions based on season guest health and what ailments needed addressing. The variety made sense in a medical system where food and medicine overlapped completely. Alongside hippocras servants bring possets drinks made from hot milk curdled with wine or ale sweetened with sugar or honey, spiced similarly to hippocras. These are comfort drinks, soothing and warming, supposedly excellent for helping sleep after feast overstimulation. The texture is strange, slightly lumpy from the curdling creamy but also alcoholic sweet, but with the tang of fermentation underneath. You receive a cup of something probably not hippocras proper, as that seems reserved for higher tables, but spiced wine of some kind. The first sip is intensely sweet, almost cloying, followed by waves of cinnamon heat and ginger sharpness. Its warming going down, coating your throat with honey wine residue, and almost immediately you feel the alcohol hitting harder than regular wine. This is strong stuff, concentrated, designed to finish the evening decisively. Think about the ritualistic aspect of these closing drinks. The feast has been spectacle for hours, food as theatre eating as performance. Now as it winds down, the drinks shift everything toward intimacy and warmth. Hippocras and possets don't demand attention the way peacocks and sugar castles did. They're meant to be sipped slowly to facilitate conversation, to ease the transition from feast energy to eventual departure or sleep. The posset's curdled texture takes getting used to. Your mouth expects smooth liquid, not these little lumps of milk wine curds. But the flavour is pleasant, comforting in ways that make sense after hours of rich food and sensory overload. This is nursery food, elevated with alcohol and spices childhood comfort repackaged for adult consumption. Historians still argue about how drunk medieval feast-goers typically got. The alcohol content of medieval wine and ale was lower than modern equivalents, no distillation yet, so no spirits, just fermented beverages topping out around 10 to 12% alcohol. But quantity compensated for weakness. Tonight you've been drinking for hours, cup after shared cup, and now these spice-sweetened drinks are hitting a system already well lubricated. The hall's atmosphere shifts as drinks circulate. Conversation gets louder, laughter more frequent, inhibitions softer. Musicians play gentler tunes, recognizing the evening's arc. Some guests are clearly ready to leave you, see yawns being suppressed, eyes drooping despite efforts to remain alert. Others are catching second wind, the hippocras energizing them, settling in for more drinking and talking now that the food performance has ended. The medical justification for ending with sweet-spiced drinks was elaborate. Medieval physicians believed heavy meals created thick, cold humours in the stomach that needed warming and thinning. The spices in hippocras provided heat. The sugar and honey provided sweetness that supposedly aided digestion. The alcohol thinned the blood and promoted circulation. Together, these drinks were pharmaceutical interventions disguised as pleasant libations. Women often received possets preferentially based on beliefs that their constitutions were naturally colder and moister than men's, requiring more warming, comforting drinks. Men got hippocras or strong-spiced wine. The gendering of beverages reflected broader medical theories about sex differences, most of which were nonsense, but deeply believed nonsense that shaped everything from drink selection to clothing choices. Your cup is empty, and a servant refills it. Generosity with alcohol is one area where medieval hosts rarely skimped. Drunk guests were happy guests, likely to remember the feast favourably, less likely to notice food running out or entertainment lagging. The final hours of feasts often dissolved into pleasant haze, where everyone felt warm, well-fed, and convinced they'd attended something magnificent. The Hippocras tradition will persist for centuries, surviving into early modern period, before declining as coffee and tea introduce new after-dinner drink options. But for now, in this medieval hall, spiced wine represents the height of sophistication, medical wisdom made drinkable luxury you could pour into cups and share generously. You notice the dogs beneath tables are investigating spilled posset, and Hippocras lapping experimentally, then retreating with expressions suggesting they find the sweetness off-putting. Even alcohol-tolerant medieval hounds have limits. The cats that have appeared from nowhere as cats do show zero interest in drinks, focused instead on meat scraps and their own mysterious feline agendas. The evening is winding down. The final course, whatever it might be, can't be far off. Your belly is full to discomfort, your head is pleasantly fuzzy with spiced wine, and you're starting to understand why medieval feast attendees needed the next day to recover. This isn't just dinner. This is endurance event sensory marathon performance that demands audience participation until the final moment. The musicians shift to something slower, softer, a melody that signals endings rather than beginnings. The torches have burned down considerably. You can see the hall is dimmer now, shadows deeper, the smoke haze thicker after hours of fires and candles. Servants are clearing with less urgency, moving with the fatigue of people who've been working since before guests arrived and still have hours of clean-up ahead. The feast is approaching its conclusion, and everyone guesses staff. Even the dog seems ready for it to end. A final platter appears, but it's modest compared to earlier spectacles. Wafers, thin, crisp cookies made from batter, poured into patterned irons and cooked over coals, arrive stacked on plates. They're simple, delicate, flavoured with rose water or anise, meant to be eaten with the remaining hippocras or posset. This is the medieval equivalent of a palate cleanser, something light and sweet to finish the marathon of rich foods. You take a wafer when the plate passes and it dissolves almost immediately on your tongue, crispy sweet, barely substantial, more texture than flavour. After everything tonight has demanded of your digestive system, this gentle conclusion feels merciful. The wafers don't challenge, don't surprise, don't require performance or appreciation beyond simple consumption. The Lord stands and the hall quiets. Somewhat people who are still capable of attention focus on him, while those too drunk or too exhausted continue their own conversations at lower volume. He's giving the closing speech thanking guests for attending, praising his kitchen staff, making some political points disguised as hospitality, ensuring everyone remembers who provided this abundance and why they should feel obligated to him. Think about what this feast accomplished beyond just feeding people. Every dish was a statement, every presentation a claim about power, wealth, connections, taste. The peacock in its feathers said we have access to exotic birds and skilled preparation. The gilded food said we can afford to waste gold. The sugar castle said we have international trade connections and disposable income. The lamprey said we eat what killed kings and survive. The umble's pie said even our lower tables eat well, proving our household's overall prosperity. This wasn't just dinner, it was propaganda theatre, political manoeuvring, social reinforcement and entertainment, all compressed into several hours of elaborate eating. Guests will leave with full bellies certainly, but more importantly with memories, stories, obligations. They witnessed the host's power made edible. They consumed his generosity literally. They now owe something: loyalty, support, reciprocal hosting, political alliance, the exact currency varying by relationship but the debt creation universal. Medieval feasting was economic strategy dressed in peacock feathers and gilded capon. The expense was extraordinary. Tonight's feast probably cost what several peasant families might earn in a year, but the returns properly managed justified the investment. Alliances strengthened. status confirmed, rivals reminded of your capabilities, all through the language of food which everyone understood instinctively. You look around the hall and see the evening's toll. Some nobles are slumped at tables, drunk or exhausted or both. Others maintain composure through sheer will, determined to outlast their peers. Children have mostly disappeared, carried off by servants when they fell asleep in corners or under tables. The dogs are in food coma, scattered around the rushes like furry obstacles, occasionally twitching in dreams of endless meat scraps. The lady of the house sits with her marchpane rose still beside her plate, and she looks tired but satisfied. She's overseen this operation from the social side, ensuring guests were comfortable, conversation flowed. Hierarchies were respected, but not so rigidly that people couldn't enjoy themselves. Her work was less visible than the cook's, but equally crucial to the feast's success. Servants begin distributing small gifts to departing guests, leftover marchpane sculptures, pieces of the sugar castle wrapped in cloth, sometimes actual food for their journey home if they're travelling far. This is traditional expected part of the feast's extended performance. Guests shouldn't just remember the event, they should carry physical tokens, portable reminders of the host's generosity. You notice some guests are already leaving, particularly those with long rides ahead and uncertain roads in darkness. They make their farewells, collect their gifts, and depart into the night beyond the hall's warmth and light. Others are settling in for more drinking. The feast may be ending, but the evening isn't over for those who want to continue. The head cook appears briefly at the kitchen entrance, surveying the hall, checking that everything concluded successfully. He looks exhausted. He's been managing chaos for hours, coordinating dozens of staff, ensuring dishes appeared in correct order, making 100 small decisions that made tonight possible. He catches the Lord's eye, receives a nod of approval and appreciation, then disappears back into the kitchens where the real work, the cleaning, the salvaging, the managing leftovers is just beginning. Think about what happens after guests leave. The servants will clear everything, save what can be saved, feed appropriate scraps to dogs and pigs, distribute some foods to the poor, who gathered outside hoping for charity. The hall will be restored to normal, the kitchen will process the aftermath, and tomorrow life will resume less spectacular, more ordinary, the daily grinding work of maintaining a medieval household, continuing regardless of how impressive last night's feast was. But the memories will persist. The guests will tell others about the peacock, the exploding pie, the gilded food, the sugar castle, the cockentrice. The stories will spread, probably get exaggerated. I swear the castle was 6 feet tall. There were 100 birds in that pie. Everything was covered in gold, and each retelling reinforces the host's reputation, extends the feast's impact beyond its actual duration. You stand slowly, feeling the wine and the meal settling heavily, making movement awkward. Your legs are stiff from sitting on benches for hours. Your stomach is distended, uncomfortable, but not quite painful. You've eaten more tonight than you typically eat in several days, experienced flavours and spectacles you might never encounter again. You've witnessed medieval nobility at their most excessive, most creative, most human, in their desperate need to impress each other through elaborate food. The hall empties gradually, the crowd thinning, the noise level dropping. The musicians pack their instruments. The servants clear with increasing efficiency, now that guests are fewer and watching less. The fires burn lower. The smoke thins slightly as fewer cooking fires burn in the adjacent kitchens. The feast is becoming memory even as it technically continues for the handful of guests still drinking and talking in corners. You make your way toward the exit, stepping over sleeping dogs and discarded bones and rushes that need replacing after being trampled for hours. The night air hits you as you leave cold, clean, shocking after the hall's warmth and smoke. Your breath fogs immediately. Somewhere overhead, stars are sharp and clear, indifferent to human feasting and its elaborate performances. And so the feast ends, as all feasts must, with full bellies and tired bodies and memories that will fade and transform over time until tonight becomes story, becomes legend, becomes remember when, told to grandchildren who can't quite imagine sugar castles and cockentrice and birds exploding from pies. The hall behind you still glows with firelight and remaining torches. Inside, the final guests are finishing their Hippocrates sharing last conversations, prolonging the evening because returning to ordinary life after such spectacle feels too abrupt. But eventually they too will leave. The fires will bank, the hall will go dark, and tomorrow will arrive with its mundane demands, its regular meals, its daily bread that bears no resemblance to tonight's gilded, spiced, sculpted excess. You've witnessed what medieval nobility could achieve when they focused all their wealth, creativity, and obsession with status into a single evening of eating. It was magnificent, it was absurd, it was deeply human in all its contradiction, generous and hierarchical, artistic, and wasteful, delicious and deliberately challenging, memorable, and already fading into the past even as you remember it. The cold night accepts you back into ordinary darkness. Behind you, the feast concludes its final movements. Before you, the road home and eventual sleep where dreams will probably feature peacocks and sugar and organ meat, all jumbled together in the strange logic of satiated exhaustion. The medieval world did many things poorly: sanitation, medicine, social justice, basic human rights. But feasting, creating elaborate, excessive, unforgettable celebrations of food and status and creativity, they mastered that completely. Tonight proved it one astonishing dish at a time, from gilded beginning to wafer crisp end. You walk away from the warmth and light and spectacle back into regular night, carrying in your belly and memory something rare and strange and ultimately very human. The experience of excess transformed into art hunger, satisfied beyond necessity. Community celebrated through shared consumption of the elaborate and impossible. The stars don't care. The cold doesn't care. But you were there. You witnessed it. You ate the proof. And tomorrow, when someone asks what medieval noble feasting was really like, you'll have stories that barely seem believable even to yourself, even though you lived them just hours ago, even though your stomach still protests the memory. Sleep well. Dream of peacocks. Tomorrow returns to ordinary time, ordinary food, ordinary life that somehow seems dimmer after tonight's golden-spiced, spectacular excess. The hall's fires bank to embers. The final torch gutters. The dogs settle into deeper sleep. And the night embraces another feast concluded, another performance ended, another medieval evening, transformed into memory and smoke and stories that will outlive everyone who was there. Close your eyes. Let the imagined feast fade. Feel your own comfortable bed, your own time, your own century with its electric lights and modern conveniences. You've visited the past through food and spectacle. Now return. Sleep. Tomorrow holds no cockentrice, no exploding pies, no turnspit dogs, just coffee and breakfast and ordinary delicious normalcy. Rest well. The medieval banquet concludes. The video ends here. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.